Before the calling there were ordinary lives. Br. Before the roads of Galilee and the storms on the lake, and the feeding of thousands and the upper room and the cross, and the empty tomb and the ends of the earth. Before all of it. 12 men were living the only lives they knew, in fishing villages and tax booths and the corners of synagogues where the zealous young men gathered to talk about the day God would finally act. But they did not know each other yet, not all of them. Some were brothers, some were neighbors, some were strangers who would only meet the moment a carpenter from Nazareth walked past and said 2 words that changed the direction of everything. Br. But before those 2 words, the ordinary, and the ordinary matters. Because the New Testament is not a story about extraordinary people who did extraordinary things because they were extraordinary. It is a story about ordinary people who were found by something far larger than themselves and carried by it further than anyone standing in their village in the years before the calling could have imagined. But the 12 were not selected from the best. They were not the most educated or the most influential or the most spiritually advanced. They were not the students of the great rabbis. They were not the sons of priests or the heirs of religious authority. They were fishermen and a tax collector and a political radical and a handful of men whose names we barely know anything about beyond the fact that they were there, chosen, present, part of the most significant story ever told. And before they were any of those things, they were simply people, living in a time and a place that shaped them before the one who would reshape them entirely arrived. This is the world they came from, and it matters to know it before the calling comes. The world they were born into was occupied. Rome had controlled the region for decades. Its soldiers were a permanent presence on the roads and in the cities. Its taxes pressed down on every household. Its governors made decisions about Jewish lives and Jewish land and Jewish futures with the casual authority of people who believed the world existed for their convenience. For a Jewish person living in Galilee in the years before Jesus began his ministry, this occupation was not a distant political reality. It was the texture of daily life. The Roman soldier who could compel you to carry his pack for a mile, the tax collector who worked for the empire and skimmed what he could for himself, the eagle on the standard that stood for everything the promise of God seemed to be taking so long to undo. And underneath the occupation, the longing. The Jewish people were not simply a people living under foreign rule. They were a people who believed they were living inside a story that had begun with Abraham and the stars and a promise too large to fully hold, that had run through Egypt and the Exodus and the wilderness and the kingdom of David and the exile and the long, slow return. A story that was supposed to be heading somewhere. They had the scriptures. Every Sabbath in the synagogue the Torah was read. The prophets were read. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and the 12 minor prophets who had spoken of a day when God would act, when the Messiah would come, when the kingdom would be established and the oppressor sent away and the scattered gathered and the broken made whole. They were a people waiting, not passively, actively, urgently, debating in the synagogues about what the day would look like and when it would come and what the faithful were supposed to do in the meantime. Into that waiting, into that occupied longing, 12 ordinary lives were being quietly prepared without knowing it. For the moment, the one they were waiting for would walk past and say, "Come." Galilee was the north. The religious center of Jewish life was Jerusalem. The temple was there. The Sanhedrin was there. The great teachers and the established families and the institutions of religious power were all in the south. Galilee was the periphery, the region the serious people in Jerusalem looked at with a mixture of condescension and suspicion. Can anything good come from Nazareth, someone would ask later. And the question carried the full weight of what Jerusalem thought of the north. Galilee of the Gentiles, the prophets had called it, a region with too much contact with the surrounding nations, too much mixing, too much of everything that made the purists in the south uncomfortable. And yet, but the Sea of Galilee was not a sea, it was a freshwater lake, about 13 miles long and 8 miles wide, fed by the Jordan River from the north. Sitting in a basin surrounded by hills, its surface could be glassy calm in the morning and whipped into genuine danger by the afternoon when the winds came down through the surrounding valleys without warning. But around that lake, the fishing villages, Capernaum on the northern shore, Bethsaida a little further east, small communities of men who had inherited the trade from their fathers and would pass it to their sons, who knew the lake the way a person knows a difficult and beloved thing they have lived alongside their whole life. Its moods, its patterns, the places where the fish ran deep, the signs that meant a storm was coming. But these were the communities that would produce the inner circle of the 12, the brothers Peter and Andrew, the brothers James and John, Philip from Bethsaida, possibly others, men who smelled of fish and knew how to mend a net and had calluses on their hands from years of hauling. But not the students of the great rabbis, the fishermen of Galilee. And God, as he so often does, began exactly there. Simon was a fisherman, but he had always been a fisherman. His father had been a fisherman. The lake was the world he had grown up in, and the trade was the life he had inherited, and the boat was the thing he knew how to manage better than almost anything else. He was a big man in the way of men who do physical work their whole lives, broad, capable, the kind of person who walked into a room and other people noticed. Not because he was polished or refined, but because there was something in him that was simply present. Loud when he was loud, quiet when he was quiet, the kind of man other men followed without quite being able to explain why. For he had a wife, a mother-in-law, a home in Capernaum, a partnership with his brother Andrew and the sons of Zebedee, James and John, who fished the same waters and shared the same rhythms of the working day. He was not dissatisfied exactly. The life was hard the way all lives in Galilee were hard. The fishing was unpredictable. The Roman taxes took what the lake gave. The future was the same shape as the present, which was the same shape as the past. But underneath the ordinary, Simon carried something. A restlessness that he could not have named clearly if you had asked him. A sense that the story he had been raised on, the story of Abraham and the promise and the Exodus and the kingdom, was pointing somewhere. That the waiting was not permanent. That the God who had spoken to the prophets was not finished speaking. He had heard about John the Baptist, had possibly gone out to the Jordan with his brother to hear him, the voice in the wilderness calling people to repent, preparing the way for someone who was coming after him. Simon did not know yet that the someone was already walking the roads of Galilee, that he was closer than he thought, that the restlessness in him was not a character flaw but a preparation. He went back to the lake and waited without knowing he was waiting. Andrew was Simon's younger brother, Bobar, where Simon was instinct and impulse. Andrew was quieter, more watchful, the kind of person who listened before he spoke and noticed things that louder people walked past. He had lived his whole life in the considerable shadow of his older brother and had not been diminished by it. He had simply become the other thing, the one who brought people to Simon rather than being Simon. That quality would define him throughout the story that was coming. It was Andrew who first found Jesus and went immediately to find his brother and bring him. It was Andrew who pointed out the boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish when the crowd was hungry. Not with a solution, just with the noticing. Here is a thing, here is a person, here is what is available, what will you do with it? He had been one of John the Baptist's disciples standing at the river, listening to the voice in the wilderness, looking for the one John kept saying was coming. And when the one came, Andrew was one of the first to see him, to follow him down the road, to ask where he was staying, to spend a day in his company and come out the other side knowing with a certainty he could not fully explain that this was the one. "We have found the Messiah," he told his brother. But that sentence, said quietly, in a fishing village on the northern shore of a lake in Galilee, was the beginning of something Andrew could not yet see the shape of, something that would carry him further from the lake than he had ever imagined going, that would put his name in a book read in every language in every nation for 2,000 years. But that was later. Before the calling, he was just Andrew, Simon's younger brother, standing at the river, listening, watching, noticing the one who brought people to Jesus before he fully understood who Jesus was. James and John were the sons of Zebedee, but their father was a fisherman of some means. Enough means to have hired servants working alongside him on the boat, which put the family a step above the subsistence level of many in the fishing communities around the lake. Not wealthy, but not desperate either. A business, a real one. But James was the older, John the younger, and between them they generated enough intensity for twice as many people. Jesus would give them a nickname, Boanerges, sons of thunder. which tells you something about what it was like to be around them before the years of following had smoothed some of the edges. They were passionate in the way of young men who believe deeply in something and have not yet learned that belief does not require the volume turned all the way up. When a Samaritan village refused to welcome Jesus on his way to Jerusalem, it was James and John who asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But they were serious, they were committed, they were absolutely convinced that what they were part of was the most important thing happening in the world, and they were right about that last part. They were just still learning what it meant. But John was the younger, and in the years ahead he would become something the Son of Thunder did not initially appear to be becoming. The apostle of love, the one whose letters would return again and again to the same insistence: God is love, love one another. Abide in the love. But before any of that, before the transformation that was coming. John was a young man on his father's boat, hauling nets, mending them in the evening, listening to the conversations about John the Baptist and the one who was coming, feeling something stir in him that the fishing and the lake and the ordinary life of Capernaum had not been able to satisfy. But he was waiting too, without knowing what he was waiting for. Matthew was sitting at his tax collector's booth. Bar, and there the similarities with the fisherman ended abruptly. Burr, a tax collector in first-century Judea, was not a neutral figure. He was a collaborator, a man who had chosen to work for the Roman system of extraction, who had taken the empire's authority and used it to collect what Rome required, and then whatever additional amount he could justify keeping for himself. The system was built for corruption. The tax collectors were its local face. In the eyes of his community, Matthew was a traitor, not in the dramatic sense of a man who had switched armies in a battle, in the daily grinding sense of a man who had chosen money over people, who sat in his booth every day and took from his neighbors what the empire demanded and possibly more, who had excluded himself from the synagogue community, who ate with the wrong people and kept the wrong company, and had made a transaction with himself somewhere along the way that the transaction was worth it. But we do not know what his life felt like from the inside. The New Testament does not give us Matthew's inner monologue before the calling. We do not know if he had settled into the choice comfortably or if it sat in him like a stone, if he counted his money at the end of each day with satisfaction or with something else. What we know is that when Jesus walked past the booth and said, "Follow me," Matthew got up immediately and left everything. No hesitation recorded, no negotiation, no request for time to think it over or settle his affairs or say goodbye to the life he was walking away from. He got up and followed. And then he threw a party, a great banquet, at his house, and invited all the tax collectors and sinners he knew to come and meet the one who had just called him. Whatever had been sitting in Matthew before the calling, the leaving of it was not difficult. The finding of what came after was worth everything he left behind. Philip was from Bethsaida. The same town as Peter and Andrew. A man who would later be found by Jesus directly. Not brought by a brother or pointed by a prophet, found. Jesus sought him out specifically, "Follow me." And Philip followed and then did what Andrew had done. He went to find someone else and bring them. He found Nathanael and said, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." But Nathanael said, "Nazareth, can anything good come from there?" But Philip said, "Come and see, but come and see." 3 words that contain a whole philosophy of invitation: not argue and be convinced, not read the evidence and reach a conclusion. Come, see, let the encounter speak for itself. Philip was not a sophisticated apologist. He was a man who had met someone and was certain that meeting him was the thing, and that the best he could do for Nathanael was get him into the same room. Nathanael went, and when Jesus saw him coming, he said, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael was astonished. "How do you know me? I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael said, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." But the man who had dismissed Nazareth, undone by a single sentence from the one he had dismissed, not by argument, by being seen, truly seen, in the particular private place where he had been before anyone called him. That is what Jesus did in every encounter. He saw the person, not the category, not the reputation, not the label, the person. and being truly seen by him was enough to change the direction of a life. Bar Nathanael left the fig tree and followed Simon the Zealot. The name tells you almost everything available about him before the calling. Zealot, the political movement that believed the only appropriate response to Roman occupation was resistance, possibly armed resistance. Men who had looked at the occupation and concluded that the God of Israel required his people to act, to fight, to drive the pagans from the Holy Land by whatever means necessary. We do not know how far along the spectrum of zealot commitment Simon sat. The movement ranged from the passionate and non-violent to the dangerous. What we know is that the name stayed with him, that it was significant enough to distinguish him from the other Simon in the group. Simon Peter and Simon the Zealot, two men with the same name and almost nothing else in common, because sitting at the same table as Simon the Zealot was Matthew the tax collector. Think about that for a moment. A man who had devoted himself to resisting Roman collaboration and a man who had built his livelihood on it, in the same group, called by the same person, being shaped toward the same mission. That is not an accident. That is the kingdom deliberately constructed to contain the people who should not be in the same room together, who had every human reason to be enemies, who had to learn a different kind of loyalty than the one they had come in with. A loyalty not to a political position, but to a person. Simon the Zealot left something behind when he followed Jesus. Not just his political commitments, the whole framework of how he had understood the problem and the solution, the whole map of who was in and who was out and what God required. He left it and walked into a group that included his ideological enemy and was asked to love him. But that is the kingdom. It has always looked like this. Thomas. He gets one name in most retellings, Doubting Thomas. 2,000 years of that label following him like a shadow from the upper room where he said, "Unless I see the nail marks, I will not believe." But Thomas, before the calling, was not primarily a doubter. He was a man of serious loyalty, of the kind of love that does not turn away from the hard thing. When Jesus announced he was going back to Judea after Lazarus had died, when the disciples knew the danger, when the reasonable thing was to stay away from the place where the religious leaders had recently tried to stone him, it was Thomas who said, "Let us also go that we may die with him. Let us also go that we may die with him." That is not the statement of a man without faith. That is the statement of a man who had decided that wherever Jesus went, he was going, even if going meant dying, not because he was certain about the outcome, because he was certain about the person. Bar Thomas thought in straight lines. He needed to understand. He needed the thing to make sense. He was not someone who could hold uncertainty comfortably and keep moving. He needed to know where they were going before he could commit to the journey. "Show us the Father," he would say at the Last Supper. And that need was not a failure. It was Thomas being Thomas, the man who asked the question everyone else was thinking. Before the calling, he was simply a man of serious mind and serious loyalty, who had not yet been tested in the way that would produce the statement history remembered him for, and who had not yet been met in the doubt the way he would be met, by the one who came back through the locked door specifically for him. Thomas was not defined by his doubt. He was defined by what the doubt led to. "My Lord and my God." The others, James, the son of Alphaeus. Thaddeus, also called Judas, the son of James. Simon the Zealot we have met. Bartholomew, who may be the same person as Nathanael. These are the names that sit in the lists of the 12, without much story attached to them in the Gospels. They were there. They walked the same roads. They heard the same teaching. They watched the same miracles. They sat at the same table. They ran from the same garden. They saw the same risen Lord. But the Gospels are not biographies of the 12. They are accounts of Jesus. And the men who moved in the background of those accounts, who are named but not followed closely, deserve to be held with respect rather than overlooked. James, the son of Alphaeus. Tradition gives him the name James the less, not less in importance. Less in stature, perhaps. The quieter James, who was not the son of Zebedee, who sat in the group without the thunder, who followed without the dramatic story of a brother bringing him or a fig tree or a tax booth, just there, present, called Thaddeus, asking at the Last Supper his one recorded question. "Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world?" a man concerned about the people outside the room, about the ones not yet reached, even at the Last Supper, thinking outward. Bartholomew, Philip's friend, possibly the man Jesus saw under the fig tree, possibly the one who said, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" and was undone by being seen. These are the ones the world did not remember as clearly, but God remembered. He always remembers the ones the world overlooks. He called them by name. He gave them a place in the 12. He trusted them with the same mission he trusted Peter and James and John. They were there. And being there was everything. And then there was Judas Iscariot, but he is always listed last, in every list of the 12 in the Gospels. His name always followed by the same description. Who betrayed him? Who became a traitor? The ending written into the introduction. But before the ending there was a beginning, and the beginning was the same as the others. A calling, a leaving, a following. Years of walking the same roads and eating the same meals and watching the same miracles. He was trusted with the money. The disciples had a common purse and Judas kept it, which means at some point he was considered reliable enough for that responsibility. He was not chosen as a mistake. He was chosen as a disciple. What happened in the years between the calling and the betrayal is one of the most searched questions in the whole story. What was it? When did it turn? Was there a moment where a different choice was available and he reached for the wrong one? Was it greed? Was it disillusionment when the kingdom did not arrive the way he had expected? Was it something older and darker that had been there from the beginning? We are not given the full answer. The New Testament shows us the outcome without fully tracing the journey that led to it. 30 pieces of silver, a garden, a kiss, and afterward the return of the silver and the field bought with it, and the end that came from a man who could not live with what he had done but could not find his way to the one who could have forgiven it. He is part of the story. The uncomfortable part. The part that asks hard questions about the proximity of betrayal to belonging. About how a man can be inside the circle and still be outside the thing the circle was for. He was there, he was called, he was trusted. And something went wrong in him that he did not let be made right. The 12 included him. The story does not look away from that. And neither should we. Something was happening in Galilee. Word had been moving through the villages the way word moves in small communities, carried by fishermen coming in from the lake, by women at the well, by men returning from the synagogue with something they had heard and could not stop thinking about. A teacher from Nazareth, who spoke in the synagogue at Capernaum, and the people were astonished because he taught as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law. And the miracles. A man with an unclean spirit in the synagogue, the spirit crying out, and the teacher saying, "Be quiet and come out of him," and the spirit coming out, just like that, with authority, with a word. A fever in Simon's house, his mother-in-law burning with it, and the teacher taking her hand and lifting her, and the fever leaving immediately. By evening the whole town was gathered at the door, everyone who was sick, everyone who was suffering, brought to him, and he healed them, one by one, staying until they had all been seen. Simon had watched this happen in his own house, had seen his wife's mother well and serving at the table when that morning she had been unable to rise. He had been close enough to observe, close enough to feel the edges of something that had no category in his previous experience. And yet the next morning he went back to the lake. Because the lake was the life and the life was the lake, and whatever had happened in the house was extraordinary, but the nets still needed mending and the fish still needed catching, and the morning was already moving. He did not know that this particular morning was going to be different from every morning that had come before it. That by the time the sun was fully up, he would be standing in the middle of the most important decision of his life. He pushed the boat out into the water and went to work. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers. Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him, at once. The text moves quickly here. No deliberation recorded, no negotiation, no request for time to consider the offer. At once. The nets in the water, the boat at the shore, the morning half begun. And they left. What happened in that moment is one of the most examined and least fully explainable things in the Gospel accounts, because by any reasonable measure it should not have happened this way. A stranger walks past a working fisherman and says 2 words, and the fisherman leaves his livelihood and follows. That does not happen. Not like this. Not at once. Unless something in those 2 words carried a weight that words do not usually carry. Unless the one saying them was speaking with the same authority that had silenced the unclean spirit and lifted the fever from the woman in the house. Unless the fisherman standing there with a net in his hands had been carrying a restlessness for long enough that when the thing that could answer it finally showed up, he recognized it before he could explain it. Come follow me. 2 words. And the whole direction of Simon's life changed in the space between hearing them and responding to them. He did not know what he was walking into. He could not have. He did not know about the upper room or the garden or the courtyard fire or the beach where the question would be asked 3 times. He did not know about Pentecost or the thousands converted or the imprisonment or the road that would eventually lead to Rome. He just left the nets and followed. And that, as it turned out, was enough. Going on from there, Jesus saw 2 other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Immediately. They left the boat. They left the father. They left Zebedee standing there in the boat with the nets half mended and the hired servants watching and 2 sons walking away down the shore after a teacher from Nazareth. We are not told what Zebedee said. The text does not give him a line. He simply recedes from the story. A father watching his sons choose something he could not follow them into. There is something in that image that deserves to sit for a moment. The cost of the calling was not only felt by the ones who answered it, it was felt by the ones they left behind. The father with the mended nets and the empty places at the table, the wife at home when the fisherman did not come back from the shore, the community that had known these men by one set of definitions and now had to find new ones. But the calling disrupted more than 12 lives. It disrupted the worlds those 12 lives were embedded in. But James walked away from everything he had been building toward. John walked away from the inheritance. Both of them left without the kind of explanation that would have made sense to anyone standing on that shore watching, because there was no explanation that would have made sense. Not yet. Not until the story had finished telling itself. They just left, immediately, climbing out of the boat that had been their whole world and walking into the one that was just beginning. Zebedee watched them go, and the morning carried on, as mornings do. Andrew had already been watching Jesus before Simon had. He had been one of John the Baptist's disciples, standing at the river, listening. And when John pointed at Jesus and said, "Look, the Lamb of God," Andrew and another disciple turned and followed Jesus down the road. Jesus turned and saw them following. "What do you want?" he asked. "Rabbi," they said, "where are you staying?" "Come and see," he said. And they went and spent the day with him, and something happened in that day that Andrew could not fully put into words, but that he carried back to his brother like a gift he was desperate to give away. "We have found the Messiah," he told Simon. "We have found him. Not I think I may have found. Not there is someone you should consider investigating. We have found the Messiah." Andrew was not given to dramatic announcements. He was the quieter of the 2 brothers, the one who noticed and brought rather than the one who declared and led. But this was not a quiet announcement. This was the statement of a man who had been waiting and had stopped waiting because the thing he was waiting for had arrived. He brought Simon to Jesus, and Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. The rock brought a new name. Before any of the extraordinary things had happened, before the walking on water or the confession at Caesarea Philippi or the denial or the restoration, before any of it, Jesus looked at this fisherman and saw not only what he was, but what he was going to become. "You will be called the Rock." And he was not the rock yet. He was Simon, impulsive, loud, capable, unreliable in certain moments that were still ahead of him. But Jesus named the destination before the journey had begun. That is what he does. He sees the finished work before the work has started, and calls the person by the name of who they are becoming. Philip was found directly. No brother brought him, no prophet pointed him out, Jesus simply found him and said, "Follow me." And Philip followed. And then did the Andrew thing. He went to find someone else. Nathanael was sitting under a fig tree, doing what people do under fig trees in the heat of the day. Resting, praying possibly, in the private space that the shade and the solitude provided. Philip found him and said, "We have found the one Moses wrote about, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nazareth. Nathanael said, "Really?" But the dismissal was instinctive, a geographical prejudice built over years of knowing where the important things came from and where they did not. Nazareth was not on the list of places from which anything significant had ever emerged. "Come and see," Philip said. And Nathanael went, because Philip was his friend, because come and see was harder to dismiss than an argument, because the only way to know was to go. And when Jesus saw Nathanael coming, he said, "Here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false." Nathanael stopped. "How do you know me?" "But I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." The private place, the moment no one had observed, named by a stranger from Nazareth before they had exchanged a word. Nathanael said, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." The man who had dismissed Nazareth with a sentence was declaring the Messiah with one, not because an argument had won him over, because he had been seen, in the particular private way that only the one who sees everything can see, and being truly seen was enough. Matthew was at his booth. The day was ordinary. The transactions were ordinary. The weight of being who he had chosen to be was ordinary in the way that things you carry every day become ordinary even when they are heavy. And Jesus walked past and looked at him and said, "Follow me," the looking matters. Because looking at a tax collector in first-century Judea carried implications. The religious teacher who looked at a tax collector with contempt was participating in the agreed-upon social verdict. The one who looked at him without contempt was saying something with his eyes before he said anything with his words. And then the words. "Follow me." Matthew got up and followed. That is all the text gives us. Matthew got up and left everything and followed him. No recorded deliberation, no emotional description, just the getting up and the leaving and the following. But then the banquet. Matthew threw a great feast at his house, and there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others eating with them. As though the first thing he wanted to do with a new life was share it. As though the people he had been living among in his old life were the first ones he wanted to bring into contact with the thing that had changed his. But the Pharisees saw this and said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus heard it and said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous but sinners." The banquet was a theology. The guest list was a sermon. The teacher who had walked past the booth and looked without contempt was the same teacher who sat down at the table without apology and ate with every person that the religious establishment had written off. Matthew had left the booth, but he had brought his whole world to the table. Sometime later, Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted. And they came to him. He appointed 12, so that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. 12. The number was not accidental. Israel had 12 tribes. The 12 disciples were not just a group of followers. They were a symbolic reconstitution. A new Israel. The beginning of the people of God being rebuilt from the center outward, from these 12 ordinary men gathered on a mountainside in Galilee outward to the ends of the earth. He named them. Simon, whom he named Peter. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. 12 names. Read them slowly. Each one a person who had been living an ordinary life and had heard 2 words and left, each one bringing everything they were into the group. The impulsiveness and the quietness and the thunder and the caution and the political fire and the calculating mind and the serious loyalty and the questions and the willingness to be there even when the being there cost something. The mountainside was not a classroom. Jesus did not gather the 12 to give them a curriculum. He gathered them so that they might be with him. The being with him was the formation. The proximity was the education, the watching and the listening and the eating and the traveling and the getting it wrong and being corrected and getting it right and being affirmed. But though they were with him for 3 years, and those 3 years changed them into people who could change the world, but first they had to learn what it meant to follow. The first days together were disorienting, but not unpleasant, not frightening, disorienting, because everything that had previously organized a day, the rhythm of the fishing, the structure of the tax collection, the routine of the political meeting, was gone, replaced by something that had no established rhythm. By following a teacher who moved when he decided to move and stopped when he decided to stop and talked to people nobody else would have talked to and said things that nobody else was saying. Peter noticed things in those early days that he would carry for years. The way Jesus prayed. He rose very early while it was still dark, left the house and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Peter woke once and found him gone, searched for him, found him in the dark, alone, in conversation with someone who was not visible, and understood for the first time that the authority he had watched operate in the synagogue and in his mother-in-law's room was connected to something that happened in the dark before anyone else was awake. The teaching was different from everything Peter had heard in the synagogue. The teachers of the law quoted other teachers. Rabbi, this said, the tradition holds that. They built their authority on the chain of human voices behind them. Jesus said, I tell you, first person, direct, as though he was not passing on received wisdom but speaking from the source of it. Botbiar and the crowds, everywhere they went. The sick brought to him, the curious pressing in, the religious leaders watching with a suspicion that was already sharpening into something harder. Peter was in the middle of all of it, learning as he went, misunderstanding often, understanding sometimes, always close, always watching Gobbar. He had left the nets. He had not yet understood what he had left them for, but he was beginning to suspect it was larger than anything the lake had ever offered. John was paying attention in a particular way, but he would write about these days later, much later, after the cross and the resurrection and the decades of the early church. He would write a gospel that opened not with a genealogy or the manger, but with the eternal. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He had not known that on the first day. He had not sat in the boat with his father Zebedee and thought, I am in the presence of the eternal Word of God made flesh. He had thought, this is a remarkable teacher from Nazareth. Come on, James, we should follow him, but in the days and months that followed, something accumulated in John. A way of seeing that was different from the way the others saw. The same events, the same words, the same meals and roads and storms and miracles. But John was absorbing them into a framework that was building slowly into the deepest theological understanding of Jesus that the New Testament contains. He noticed the love, not just the power. Every miracle he would record was also a sign, a window into something larger than the event itself. The water into wine was not just a party rescue, it was glory revealed. The feeding of the thousands was not just a logistical problem solved, it was the bread of life present in the world. John was learning to read Jesus, not just to follow him, to understand what the following meant, to sit with the discrepancy between what they expected the Messiah to be and what this person actually was, until the discrepancy resolved not into disappointment, but into something vastly larger than the expectation had been. For he was young, the youngest of the 12 possibly, still learning the grammar of what he was seeing, but he was paying attention, the kind of attention that would eventually produce the sentence no other gospel writer wrote. In the beginning was the Word. Matthew was writing things down. Not officially, not yet, but he was a man of accounts, of records, of the careful noting of what had happened so it would not be lost. The discipline of the tax collector turned towards something it had never been pointed at before, for he noticed the details the others walked past. The exact words, the precise sequence, the names of the people who were healed, the specific questions that were asked and the specific answers that were given. He had spent years recording transactions. Now he was in the middle of something that was not a transaction at all, and he was still recording, still noting, still carrying the instinct of the careful observer into the extraordinary circumstances of following a rabbi who was unlike any rabbi anyone had ever followed. He would write his gospel for the Jewish community, rooted in the scriptures, demonstrating with meticulous care how Jesus fulfilled the promises of the Old Testament. This is the one Moses wrote about. This is the one Isaiah described. See how it fits. See how the story has been running toward this point all along. That instinct was already forming in those early days. The watching and the noting and the connecting of what he was seeing to the scriptures he had grown up hearing in the synagogue. Matthew had left the booth. But he had brought the discipline of the booth with him, the careful attention, the recording of what mattered, the refusal to let the significant slip past unremembered. He was gathering material, without knowing yet what he would do with it. Without knowing that what he was writing in his memory in those early days of following would eventually become a book that would be read in every language in every nation until the end of the world. He just kept watching and noting and following. Thomas asked questions, not disruptive ones, not the questions of a man trying to undermine the teaching, the questions of a man who genuinely needed to understand before he could move, who could not proceed on assumption or vague conviction, who required the thing to make actual sense. But the others sometimes moved before they understood. Peter especially. Peter would leap and figure out later what he had leapt into. Thomas could not leap like that. He needed the ground beneath his feet to be solid before he stepped. In the early days, this meant he was often the one asking the question everyone else had decided not to ask. The clarifying question, the how does this work question, the what exactly do you mean question. Sometimes the others found it frustrating. The conversation was moving, the teacher was speaking, and Thomas needed to go back and make sure the foundation was secure before the structure could rise any higher. But Jesus never seemed frustrated by it. He answered Thomas every time, not impatiently, with the same directness and the same attention that he gave to every question that came from a genuinely seeking heart. But Thomas was a man who took things seriously, who did not wear his convictions lightly, who, when he gave his loyalty, gave it with the full weight of himself behind it. Let us also go that we may die with him, he had said, when Jesus announced the return to dangerous Judea. But that was not the statement of a man who was casually committed. That was the statement of a man who had asked all his questions and reached the conclusion and was now prepared to follow that conclusion wherever it led. Even to death. He did not know yet that the conclusion he had reached would be tested in a locked room, that the faith he had built so carefully on solid ground would crack in the days after the cross, and that the one who had answered every question would come back specifically to answer the last one, but that was ahead. In the early days, Thomas was just asking questions and following. The 12 were together. That simple fact is worth holding before the story moves forward into everything that was coming. 12 men from different backgrounds with different temperaments and different histories and different ways of seeing the world, in the same group, following the same person. Be the fisherman and the tax collector, the zealot and the questioner, the loud and the quiet, the ones who would become famous and the ones history would barely remember. All of them together on the roads of Galilee in the early days of following. They ate together, they slept in the same places, they had the conversations that happen when people spend enough time together that the managed version of themselves starts to give way to the actual version. They irritated each other and helped each other and competed with each other for the teacher's attention, and misunderstood him together, and occasionally understood him together in the moments when the teaching landed in a way that left them looking at each other and knowing they had all felt the same thing. They were becoming something, not quickly, not without conflict and confusion and the slow grinding work of 12 very different people learning to be one group. But they were together, and the one who had called them was with them, teaching by proximity, by the way he treated the people no one else stopped for, by the way he prayed before anyone else was awake, by the words he said on the mountainside that none of them would ever fully exhaust. They had left their nets and their booth and their political commitments and their fig tree. They had said yes to 2 words from a teacher in Galilee. And the road ahead was longer and stranger and more costly and more glorious than any of them could have imagined standing at the beginning of it. But they were on it, together, following, and that was where everything began. They had left everything to follow a teacher they barely knew. And in the weeks and months that followed the calling, the question that the leaving had created was being answered, not all at once, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the accumulation of days, in the steady weight of miracle after miracle and teaching after teaching and encounter after encounter that built into something none of them had a word for yet. But who is this man? That question runs underneath the whole of the early ministry, the disciples asking it without always knowing they were asking it, the crowds asking it loudly, the religious leaders asking it with a hostility that was sharpening into something dangerous, the wind and the waves being asked it in a way they answered without hesitation. Who is this man? But the 12 were closer to him than anyone. They walked the same roads, they ate at the same tables, they heard the teaching not once in a crowd but again and again in private. Jesus explained things to them that he did not explain to the crowds. He took them aside. He answered their questions when everyone else had gone home. He was forming them in the particular way that proximity to someone forms you. Not just through what is said, but through what is demonstrated, through the way a person moves through the world, through what they stop for and what they ignore, and how they treat the people the world has treated carelessly. But the 12 were being formed, day by day, without always knowing it, by the most extraordinary teacher who had ever walked the roads of Galilee, and the miracles were not the least of the formation. They were in the synagogue at Capernaum. Jesus was teaching. And the people were astonished at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law. And then a man with an unclean spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "But be quiet," Jesus said, "come out of him." For the unclean spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits and they obey him." But the disciples were in the room. They saw it. They heard the shriek and the silence that followed, and the astonished faces of the people turning to each other. They were part of the crowd that was amazed, and yet they were not quite the crowd. They were the ones who had already said yes, who had already committed to following before the full weight of what they were following had become clear. Bar Peter stood in the synagogue and felt the ground shift slightly under the category of teacher he had assigned to the man from Nazareth, because the teachers of the law did not do this. The teachers of the law quoted other teachers. They did not command unclean spirits and be obeyed before the sentence was finished. Whatever this was, it was not what he had expected, not what any of them had expected. They had expected a rabbi, a good one, possibly a great one, the greatest they had ever heard. Bar, they were getting something they did not have a word for yet. Bot bar, and the day was just beginning. That same day Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon and Andrew. Bar. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever. They told Jesus about her. Br, so he went to her, took her hand and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. Peter watched this happen in his own house. The woman who that morning had been unable to rise from her bed was now moving through the room bringing food and attending to their needs. The fever simply gone, as though it had been a visitor who had been asked to leave and had left. But he had seen the synagogue, he had heard the shriek of the Spirit. But this was different. This was his family, his home, the particular private world of a fisherman's house on the northern shore of a lake. And the teacher from Nazareth had walked into it and taken a sick woman's hand, and the sickness had left. Bar Peter was a practical man. His whole life had been built on things he could hold and measure and predict. The lake, the nets, the weight of a catch, the signs that told him a storm was building. He trusted what he could verify. He was verifying this, with his own eyes, in his own house. By evening the whole town was gathered at the door. Everyone who had a sick or suffering person brought them, and Jesus healed them one by one, staying until all had been seen, until the long line of the broken and the hurting had all passed before him and been met. But Peter watched that too, watched the patience of it, the individual attention given to each person, the way no one was processed or managed or moved along before their moment was complete. Each one a person, each one fully present to the one who was healing them. He stayed until all of them had been seen. Bar that detail settled in Peter, and did not leave. They were crossing the lake. Bar evening. The water calm when they pushed off. Jesus in the stern of the boat, his head on a cushion, asleep. The kind of sleep that comes from a day of continuous giving, of the crowd and the healing and the teaching and the presence that goes out of you when you are fully present to that many people for that long. B slept. And the disciples sailed up Bar, and then the storm came. But the storms on the Sea of Galilee were known to the fishermen. They had spent their lives reading the signs of them, the way the light changed, the way the wind shifted. They knew the lake, but this one was beyond what knowing the lake prepared them for. A furious squall, the waves breaking over the boat, the water coming in faster than they could manage it, and the teacher asleep in the stern. They woke him. "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" But he got up, rebuked the wind, said to the waves, "Quiet, be still," and the wind died. And there was a complete calm. But he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" But they were terrified. And they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Notice what terrified them. Not the storm, they were fishermen. They had managed storms before. What terrified them was the calm that followed the two words. The absolute, immediate, complete calm. The water that had been breaking over the sides of the boat lying flat, as though there'd been no storm at all, that terrified them. Because the storm was a natural thing. A violent one, but natural. And what had just happened was not natural, was not the kind of thing that could be explained by any category available to them. Or who is this? The question was becoming more urgent, and they were beginning to suspect the answer was larger than they were ready for. Andrew was in the boat when the storm happened. He had grown up on this lake, had learned its moods from his father and from Simon, and from the years of reading it the way you read something you depend on for your survival. He knew what a storm on the Sea of Galilee felt like from the inside of a boat. He had never felt what he felt when the calm came. It was not relief exactly. Relief he knew, the relief of a storm passing, of the wind easing and the waves settling and the boat stabilizing and everyone breathing again. He knew that feeling. This was not that. This was something else, something that sat in his chest differently. That made the relief feel small next to it, because the storm had not passed. It had been stopped, by a word, by a person he had been sitting 2 arm lengths away from for weeks, the person he had brought his brother to. The person he had said we have found the Messiah about before he fully understood what the Messiah was. Andrew was the one who brought people, the one who noticed and connected and presented, the quiet connector. But sitting in the settled boat in the sudden flat calm, he was not thinking about who he could bring. He was just sitting with the fact of what he had witnessed. The wind and the waves obeyed him. He had believed, he had brought Simon, he had followed, he had committed before the full evidence was in. That was the kind of man he was, the early adopter, the one who trusted the instinct before the logic caught up. Now the logic was catching up, in a way that was bigger than the logic could fully hold. He sat in the quiet water and let it settle into him. The knowledge that was reshaping everything he thought he knew about what was possible and who he was following and what it might mean to be this close to him for however long the following lasted. Andrew sat with it and did not say a word. He sent them out. This was the moment the formation reached a new stage. Jesus called the 12 together, gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases, and sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. "Take nothing for the journey," he said. "No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, leave their town and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them." They went out, in pairs, and they traveled from village to village proclaiming the good news and healing people everywhere. But this was new. This was the 12 not observing but doing, not watching him heal but healing themselves, not listening to him teach but standing in front of crowds and proclaiming the kingdom with their own voices. The authority was given, not earned, not produced by training or discipline or years of accumulated spiritual development. Given, take it and go, and they went. And it worked. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. But something happened in the going that could not have happened in the watching. The disciples who had been learning by proximity were now learning by action. The faith that had been building through the miracles they had witnessed was now being exercised through the miracles they were participating in. They came back changed, not dramatically, not with the full understanding of what they had been part of, but changed in the particular way that action changes people, that doing the thing rather than watching the thing produces in a person something that observation alone cannot. They had gone out with nothing and come back with more than they had left with. When the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. But the crowds found out and followed, and he welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed healing. Late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him. "Send the crowd away," they said, "so they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we are in a remote place here." But he replied, "You give them something to eat." They said, "We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for all this crowd." About 5,000 men were there, but the disciples stood between the instruction and the impossibility. You give them something to eat. With 5 loaves and 2 fish, for 5,000 men plus women and children. The arithmetic was not just difficult, it was a category of impossible that had a completely clear and obvious answer. We cannot send them away. But Jesus said, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." And they did. They went through the crowd, group by group, 50 by 50, organizing people they had no idea how to feed, and brought the 5 loaves and the 2 fish to Jesus. He looked up to heaven and gave thanks and broke them, and he kept giving them to the disciples to set before the people. For he kept giving to the disciples, who kept distributing, who kept watching the bread that should have run out keep not running out, who walked through 5,000 people, handing out food that multiplied in their hands with every piece they gave away. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over, 12 baskets, 1 for each of them. The provision that had seemed impossible producing more than they had started with. Philip had been the one who noticed the crowd was hungry before anyone else raised it. He had been walking through the gathered people late in the day, and the practical reality of several thousand people in a remote place with no food had landed on him with the specific weight of a man who thought in practical terms. There was a problem here. Someone needed to name it. He brought it to Jesus, and Jesus tested him. Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Philip calculated. 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. He said it clearly. Not as a complaint, as a statement of the facts as he understood them. The money available was insufficient for the problem at hand. He was right. By every reasonable calculation he was right. What he did not yet have fully worked into his thinking was that the reasonable calculation did not apply to every situation. That standing next to the one who had multiplied the water into wine and stilled the storm with 2 words changed the mathematics of what was possible. Jesus already knew what he was going to do. The testing was for Philip's benefit, not to embarrass him, to give him an opportunity to see his own reasoning, to notice where his faith was drawing a line that the one he was following did not draw. Philip would learn. He was learning. The sending out had changed something in him. The walking through the villages and seeing the sick healed through his own hands had widened his sense of what was available when Jesus was in it. But the lesson of the 5 loaves was a different one. Not the power working through him, the provision coming through him. The bread multiplying in his hands as he distributed it. He carried 12 baskets of leftovers back to where they had started, and sat with what they meant. The insufficient is enough when you bring it to him. The night after the feeding, Jesus went up on a mountainside alone to pray. He had sent the disciples ahead of him in the boat to cross to the other side, and they were out on the water, struggling to row because the wind was against them. In the 4th watch of the night, 3 in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then Peter got out of the boat and called to him, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." Come, Jesus said. And Peter walked on the water toward Jesus. That fact deserves to sit without being rushed past. Every retelling of this story focuses on the sinking, on the moment Peter took his eyes off Jesus and looked at the wind and the waves and went under. And that moment is real and important. but before the sinking there was the walking. But Peter was the only one who got out of the boat. 11 disciples stayed where it was safe. 11 men who had seen the feeding of the 5,000 and the stilling of the storm and the healing in the synagogue and in the house stayed in the boat because getting out of the boat made no sense. Bar Peter got out. Not because he had more faith than the others exactly, because whatever was in him that made him Peter made it impossible to watch Jesus out there and stay in here. The impulse to move toward him was stronger than the impulse to stay safe. He walked on the water, and then he looked at the wind, and he sank, and the hand was already there. For 11 disciples learned something that night from inside the boat. Peter learned something different. From the water, James was watching from the boat. He watched his brother John watch Peter get out. He watched the 11 of them grip the sides and hold their position, while Peter climbed over the edge and stood on the surface of the water and walked. He had grown up with Peter, had fished the same waters, had mended nets in the same evenings, had grown up enough in proximity to the sons of Jonah to know what it was to be around the particular combination of courage and recklessness that made Simon Peter the person he was. And even knowing that, watching Peter actually do it was extraordinary. But James was not a cautious man. He was a son of thunder, the one who would ask Jesus to call fire down on a Samaritan village, the one who would request with his brother the seats of honor at the right and left hand when the kingdom came. He was not given to holding back. Bar, but he had held back in the boat. And watching Peter walk and then sink and then be caught by the hand that was already extended had produced something in him that he was not sure he had language for yet. But not regret exactly, not shame, something more like the awareness of a gap between the faith he thought he had and the faith that got out of the boat. He and John were in each other's company through everything. The shared temperature of the thunder, the shared ambition, the shared fire that would eventually burn in 2 very different directions. John toward the love, James toward the martyrdom that would come first of all of them. But that night in the boat, they were just 2 brothers watching another man do something impossible and feeling the gap between what they believed and what they were willing to risk on the believing. They were still learning. All of them were still learning, and the teacher was not finished with them yet. They were beginning to understand something, but not everything, not yet. The full understanding was still ahead of them, still on the other side of the cross and the empty tomb and the morning when the Spirit fell on the room and everything that had been confusing suddenly opened into clarity. But something, bar the authority, was real. They had seen it in the synagogue, in Peter's house, on the water, in the multiplication of the bread, in the sending out when it had operated through their own hands. The authority was not a performance, not a trick, not the kind of thing that works sometimes and not others. It was consistent, reliable, operating from a source that did not deplete. But the teaching was real. The Sermon on the Mount had settled in them the way a very large thing settles, not fully absorbed, too large for that, but present, shaping the way they were beginning to see the world. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Love your enemies. Do not worry about tomorrow. Seek first the kingdom. These were not comfortable sayings. They were not the kind of wisdom that made ordinary life easier. They were the kind of wisdom that required a whole different orientation toward ordinary life, a whole different set of questions asked about each day, a whole different measure of what mattered. Br, and the person himself, the way he moved through the world, the people he stopped for, the ones he touched that nobody else touched, the patience in the endless line of sick people at the door, the compassion that kept giving after a day that should have emptied anyone. But they were being formed by all of it, by the miracles and the teaching and the proximity to the person, being made into something they were not when they left the nets and the booth and the fig tree. They did not know yet where the road was going, but they were on it, and the one leading them was unlike anyone who had ever walked these roads before. But they were beginning to understand that, and the understanding was changing them. There were things they did not understand, but that is equally important to say. The formation was real, the change was real, and they were still frequently wrong, still missing the point, still reaching for categories that did not fit and asking questions that revealed how far they still had to go. They argued about who among them was the greatest, sitting around a meal with the one who had washed their feet, They argued about who was the greatest. They tried to stop a man who was driving out demons in Jesus' name because he was not part of their group. "Master," they said, "we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he is not one of us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for whoever is not against you is for you." But they wanted to call fire down on a village that had not welcomed them. They fell asleep in the garden when he asked them to keep watch. But they did not understand the parables at first and had to ask him to explain them in private. They did not understand the teaching about the yeast of the Pharisees and argued among themselves that it was because they had forgotten to bring bread. They did not understand what rising from the dead meant when he mentioned it on the way down from the mountain. They were human, fully, completely, sometimes frustratingly human. The calling had not made them extraordinary in themselves. It had put them in the company of the extraordinary. Bar, and the extraordinary one was patient with the ordinary ones, again and again. Explaining, redirecting, correcting without destroying, seeing the finished work in the still unfinished people. Bar, they were being formed. Imperfectly, slowly, in the way that all genuine formation happens, through time and proximity and failure and correction, and the accumulation of days in which the teacher kept teaching and they kept trying and sometimes getting it right and more often not yet, but following, always following. The road was getting them somewhere. Even the failures were getting them somewhere, and the one leading them had not given up on any of them yet. He went up on a mountain. Bar, and he sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them. Bar, that is how Matthew introduces it. The simplicity of it is almost misleading. A man sat down on a hillside and opened his mouth, and what came out was the most concentrated and demanding and beautiful body of teaching in all of human history. Bar, the 12 were there, sitting on the grass with the crowd pressing in around them and the lake visible below and the hills of Galilee rising behind, and the teacher who had called them from their boats and their booths sitting in the middle of it all and speaking. They had heard him teach before, in the synagogues, to the crowds on the roads. They had heard the authority that astonished people, the directness, the "I tell you that" belonged to no rabbi before him. But this was different. This was the Sermon on the Mount. 3 chapters that the 12 would spend the rest of their lives unpacking. That would shape the movement they were about to become. That would be argued over and wrestled with and loved and misunderstood and lived out imperfectly and pointed toward hopefully by every person who ever tried to follow the one who spoke them. They did not know that yet. They were just sitting on a hillside listening, and the words were landing in them the way a very large thing lands. Not all at once, not with full comprehension, but with the weight of something true, something that rearranged the furniture of how you understood the world and what it was for and who was blessed in it and what the life God was calling people to actually looked like from the inside. But they listened and were changed and did not yet fully know how. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. John heard that and something moved in him. Not because he was poor in spirit, he was a son of thunder. He was young and certain and full of the fire that would one day need to find its right channel. He was not naturally inclined toward the poverty of spirit Jesus was describing. But he heard it and felt the gap between the person Jesus was describing and the person he was. And instead of the gap producing shame, it produced something more like longing, a wanting to be the thing that was being described, to be the person whose hands were empty enough to receive what the kingdom was offering. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. For he thought about them for a long time, on the hillside and then later on the road. What did it mean to see God? The tradition said no one could see God and live. Moses had been hidden in the cleft of the rock while the glory passed. The temple had the curtain, the veil between the Holy of Holies and everything else, because the presence of God was not something human eyes could bear unmediated. And Jesus said the pure in heart will see him. But John did not know yet that he was sitting next to the answer to that promise, that the seeing of God had already begun, that the Word who was with God and was God had become flesh and was teaching on a hillside in Galilee, and the seeing of him was the seeing the promise had been pointing at. He would understand that later, much later. When he wrote the gospel that would open with "In the beginning was the Word." But on the hillside he just heard the promise and felt it reach for something in him that had not yet been named. You have heard that it was said, "Love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. But Simon the Zealot sat with that one. The whole framework of his former life had been built on a clean division between the people of God and the occupiers, between the righteous and the collaborators, between those who deserved the loyalty of a Jewish man and those who did not. The Zealot movement was not built on hatred exactly. It was built on a vision of what God required. And what God required was not the accommodation of the enemy. It was the resistance of the enemy. The driving out. Love your enemies. But he had not expected that, had not been prepared for it by any reading of the tradition he had grown up in. The Psalms had imprecatory prayers. The prophets had spoken judgment on the nations. The history of Israel was the history of God acting against the enemies of his people. And now the teacher who spoke with more authority than any prophet was saying, love them. Pray for them. Be sons of your Father in heaven, who sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. Simon sat with the discomfort of it, the way a large uncomfortable truth sits, not dismissed, not resolved, just present. Pressing. He looked across the group at Matthew, the tax collector, the man who had collaborated with the system Simon had spent his life opposing, who had sat at the booth and taken from his neighbors what the empire demanded and possibly more, and who was now sitting on the same hillside, listening to the same teaching, called by the same voice. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. But Simon did not resolve the discomfort that day, but he did not leave either. He stayed on the hillside and let the teaching work on him. That was the beginning of something. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Peter heard that and almost laughed. Not from contempt, from recognition. He was a fisherman. His whole life had been organized around exactly this kind of worry. Whether the catch would be enough, whether the taxes could be paid, whether the boat would hold through another season, whether the family would have what they needed when the lake was not giving. But the worry was not a character flaw. It was the texture of a working life in first-century Galilee. It was what responsible people did. They thought ahead, they calculated, they prepared for the lean season because the lean season always came. And the teacher was saying, do not worry. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? But Peter looked at the birds, the particular kind of looking you do when someone draws your attention to something you have always seen, and suddenly you are being asked to see it differently. They did not sow, they did not reap, they did not run the calculations that Peter ran every morning before he pushed the boat out, and they were fed. He was not naive. He did not hear this and conclude that the nets did not need mending or the boats did not need managing. He understood that the teaching was not about practical irresponsibility. It was about where the anxiety lived, about the deep place in a person that either trusted the Father or did not, that either believed the bird's argument or continued to build the whole weight of the future on its own calculations. But Peter was a man who trusted what he could hold and verify, the lake, the nets, his own strength, for he was being invited to trust something he could not hold, something invisible, something that fed birds and did not explain itself. For he was not there yet, but the invitation had landed, and it had not left. The sermon ended, and they came down from the mountain. And immediately the world pressed in again with its particular weight of need. For a man with leprosy came and knelt before Jesus. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. I am willing, he said, be clean. But the 12 watched, as they had watched in the synagogue and in Peter's house. But each time was different. Each time the healing was a specific person with a specific condition and a specific moment of being seen and touched and restored. But the man with leprosy had not been touched, not by anyone. The law was clear. The skin disease made him unclean, and unclean meant untouchable, meant the warning called out to anyone approaching, unclean, unclean, meant a life lived at the edges, seen but not approached, present but kept at distance. Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. Before the healing, The touch came first. The cleaning came after. But the touch was its own statement. Before the disease was gone, the isolation was broken. Before the skin was restored, the person was reached. The hand of the teacher crossing the distance that the law had made and the culture had enforced, and the man's own years of being untouchable had made feel permanent. For Matthew watched this and felt something he would not have had words for a year earlier. He had been untouchable too. Not by law, by choice. The choice he had made at the booth, the choice to collaborate, to take, to sit behind the table and receive what the empire authorized him to take. He had been technically present in his community and functionally outside it, seen and avoided, there but not reached, .br. And Jesus had walked past his booth and looked at him and said, "Follow me." But the touch came before the cleaning. He knew that now. Watching the leper. The reaching out came before the transformation, and the reaching out was itself the beginning of the transformation. He wiped his eyes and kept watching. A Roman centurion came to Jesus in Capernaum. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." "Shall I come and heal him?" Jesus asked. But the centurion said, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. I tell that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. He said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith." But the 12 stood in the middle of this exchange and felt the particular discomfort of the praise going to the wrong person. The wrong person by every measure their upbringing had given them, a Roman, a Gentile, a soldier of the occupation, a man who had no covenant, no Torah, no standing in the house of Israel. Br. And Jesus called his faith greater than any he had found in Israel. Simon the Zealot felt the ground shift under his assumptions. The faith that Jesus praised in the centurion was not Jewish faith, was not the faith of the tradition, was not the faith that the Pharisees had cultivated through meticulous law-keeping and the Zealots had expressed through passionate resistance. It was the faith of a man who understood authority, who knew what it meant to speak a word that was obeyed because of who was speaking, who recognized the same quality in Jesus without needing the tradition or the scripture or the covenant history to tell him it was there, but he saw it directly and trusted it directly. Just say the word. Simon had been fighting for the kingdom with the weapons of political resistance. This Roman soldier had recognized the kingdom without the weapons, without the framework, without the history. The kingdom was larger than Simon had been building it. They crossed the lake again, to the region of the Gerasenes, the other side, Gentile territory, the kind of place the Jewish disciples crossed into with the low-grade awareness of being outside the familiar. Different smells, different sounds, pigs grazing on the hillsides, which told you everything about how far from Galilee you were. And immediately when Jesus stepped out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came from the tombs to meet him. The man lived among the tombs. No one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. And he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't you torture me." But the disciples stood back. There was something in the energy of this encounter that was beyond what the synagogue had been. The man among the tombs was not a disruption in a religious gathering. He was a person who had been overtaken by something that had made him completely other than himself, that had driven him out of the community and into the place of the dead and left him cutting himself in the hills. Jesus asked his name. "My name is Legion," he said, "for we are many." And Jesus drove them out, into the herd of pigs on the hillside. And the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. And the man was sitting there clothed, and in his right mind, clothed. In his right mind, sitting quietly, the man who had been among the tombs, who had been beyond binding, who had been Legion, sitting, clothed, himself again. But the disciples had watched miracles. This was different. This was a man restored from a condition so far beyond ordinary suffering that it had a name that meant an army. and he was sitting in his right mind, because Jesus had spoken. On the way back across the lake, a large crowd gathered around Jesus on the shore. Br, and a synagogue leader named Jairus fell at his feet. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." Jesus went with him, Br, and a large crowd followed, pressing around him. Br, in the crowd, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, who had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, who had spent everything she had and had only grown worse. She came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped. But Jesus turned around in the crowd. "Who touched my clothes?" But his disciples said, "You see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. The woman came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. "Daughter," he said, "your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." But the disciples had watched, had seen the moment, the crowd pressing, one touch among 1,000 touches, and Jesus stopping, turning, asking, not because he did not know who had touched him, because she needed to be found, needed the moment to be completed in the open rather than in the hidden, needed the daughter, not the cure, needed to hear the words spoken to her face that named what had happened and what it meant. The healing in the crowd could have been anonymous. He made it personal. That was the pattern the disciples were beginning to recognize. Every healing was personal. Every miracle was specific. No one was processed or managed. Each one was a person, fully present to the one who was fully present to them. While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus. "But your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" By hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. But the inner three, the ones he took with him into the moments that were not for the full group, the Transfiguration, Gethsemane, and this, the raising of Jairus' daughter. They came to the house of the synagogue leader and saw a commotion, people crying and wailing loudly. "Why all this commotion and wailing?" Jesus said. "The child is not dead but asleep." They laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. But he took her hand and said to her, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. Peter and James and John were in the room, 3 fishermen from Galilee standing at the bedside of a 12-year-old girl who had been dead and was now walking, who had been taken by the hand and told to get up. The same words the man at the pool would hear, "Get up," the same words the voice in the garden would say to Lazarus, "Come out," the same authority, the same immediacy of the response, the same complete astonishment in the people who witnessed it. Peter stood in the room and felt the category of what was possible continue to expand past every boundary he had previously understood, past every limit he had thought permanent. He had seen the fever leave. He had walked on water. He had distributed bread that multiplied in his hands. And now he was standing next to a 12-year-old girl who was walking around the room. Who is this man? Jesus gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this. And he told them to give her something to eat. Give her something to eat. After the miracle, after the astonishment, after the thing that had just happened that there were no words for, he said, "Give her something to eat." Peter almost laughed, not from disrespect, from the particular quality of that instruction in that moment. The world had just rearranged itself around a girl walking after being dead, and the response of the teacher was, "Give her something to eat," because she was hungry, because she was 12 years old and she had been ill and now she was well and she needed food, because the miraculous and the practical were not 2 different registers in the mind of Jesus, because the God who raised her was also the God who made her and knew she needed breakfast. But the disciples were learning this about him. The grand and the ordinary held together without any sense of incongruity. The cosmic authority and the personal attention, the driving out of Legion and the notice that a 12-year-old needed a meal. But he was always both. The disciples were learning to hold both, to not be surprised when the extraordinary moment gave way to a practical one, to not elevate the miraculous above the human, to understand that caring about whether someone had eaten was not beneath the dignity of the one who fed 5,000. But the kingdom was like that, present in the extraordinary and in the ordinary, in the raised child and in the meal brought to her, in the driving out of legion and in the clothed man sitting quietly in his right mind, in the storm stilled with 2 words and in the calm conversation afterward. But both, always both. But they were learning to see it. Thomas was thinking about the things that had not worked the way he expected. But not the miracles. The miracles he held carefully, each one stored in the part of his mind that kept accounts. He was a man of thorough attention, and the miracles had his thorough attention. He believed them, had seen them, had participated in some of them during the sending out. What he was thinking about was the rejection. They had gone to his hometown, Nazareth, and the people there had taken offense at him. "Who does he think he is?" they said. "Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?" But Jesus had done very few miracles there because of their lack of faith. Thomas held that. The correlation between faith and what was possible. The way the unbelief of Nazareth had created a different kind of outcome than the faith of the centurion. The way the woman with the bleeding had reached through a crowd for the hem of the garment, while the people of his hometown stood with their arms folded, wondering who he thought he was. But faith was not a passive thing, Thomas was concluding. It was not just the acknowledgement that something was true. It was the reaching, the touching of the cloak, the getting out of the boat, the coming to him through the crowd, and the difficulty and the social exposure of falling at his feet in public. The faith that moved things was the faith that moved. That did something with what it believed. Thomas was a man who needed to understand before he could commit. He knew that about himself. It was not a failing, it was the shape of him. But he was beginning to understand that the commitment itself was part of the faith, that the understanding and the acting were not sequential, that sometimes you had to step before you could see. He was working that out, slowly, carefully, in the way Thomas worked everything out. One day it would be fully tested, and he would fail the test, and then be met in the failure by the one who had seen it coming and came back anyway. But that was ahead. For now he was walking the roads of Galilee, watching, thinking, following. Something was building in all of them. But not understanding exactly, not yet. But the material of understanding was accumulating, layer by layer, miracle by miracle, teaching by teaching, encounter by encounter. They had been on the mountain for the sermon. They had watched the leper touched before he was healed. They had seen a Roman centurion praised for the faith that none of Israel had matched. They had crossed into Gentile territory and watched legion driven out and a man restored to himself. They had been in the room when a dead girl walked. They had gone out and healed in his name and come back changed. They had distributed bread that multiplied. They had walked and almost walked on water. The picture of who Jesus was had been building, not completing itself. The full picture was not visible yet, would not be visible until after everything that was coming. But the outlines were becoming clearer, the shape of the authority, the consistency of the compassion, the way the kingdom showed up in exactly the places and among exactly the people that the religious establishment had decided the kingdom would not go. For something was building, and with it a question that was sharpening into something that could not be avoided much longer. The crowds had their answer. A prophet, the greatest prophet, Elijah returned, John the Baptist raised from the dead. The Pharisees had their answer, a man who worked by the power of Beelzebul, a threat to the order, a danger to the institution. But the disciples were the ones who had been with him, who had eaten with him and slept in the same places and heard the private explanations and watched the miracles and been sent out in his authority and come back with the reports of what had happened. The question was rising in all of them, had been rising for months, was about to be asked directly by the teacher himself on a road heading north. Who do you say I am? They were almost ready to answer it. They were heading north, away from the lake and the familiar villages and the roads they had worn smooth with their traveling. North toward Caesarea Philippi, a region that carried a particular kind of religious weight, a place where the worship of other gods had been practiced for generations, where the rock face was carved with niches for the statues of the gods of the Greeks, where the city itself had been built by Philip the Tetrarch and named for Caesar. Pagan ground, the kind of place that made the question Jesus was about to ask all the more pointed. Because here, in the middle of the territory that stood for everything that was not the kingdom of God, he stopped and asked the question that had been building since the first morning on the lake. Who do people say the Son of Man is? They answered easily, John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But the crowd answers were all honorable. All placed Jesus in the line of the great, a prophet, a voice, the return of a hero of the faith. None of them were wrong exactly. They were just not enough, not large enough, not close enough to what was actually happening. Bar Jesus let the crowd answers land and then asked the real question. But what about you? Who do you say I am? Be you. The disciples, the ones who have been with me, who have eaten at the table and watched the miracles and heard the explanations nobody else heard and gone out in my name and come back with the reports, who have been closer to me for longer than anyone else walking these roads. Bod be you, who do you say I am? But the question settled over the group like weather, like something that had been moving toward them for months and had finally arrived. Peter answered. He did not look at the others first, did not consult, did not measure the response or consider the implications. He was Peter. The impulse and the response were almost simultaneous. But you are the Messiah, he said, the Son of the living God. The confession came out of him with the force of something that had been building for months, all the way from the first morning at the lake when the restlessness in him had recognized something in the man walking along the shore. Through the storm and the water and the bread and the healings, through the sending out and coming back, through every morning waking in the company of the one who had been in prayer since before the dark had lifted. The Messiah, the Son of the living God, but not just a prophet, not the return of Elijah, the one the prophets had pointed toward, the one the whole story had been building toward, the Son of God, living. Jesus said to him, Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. But flesh and blood, not the accumulation of observation alone, not the logical conclusion of the evidence, though the evidence was there, revealed by the Father. Peter had said the right thing not because he was the brightest or the most spiritually advanced, but because the Father had given him the eyes to see it. And then Jesus said something that would take the rest of Peter's life to understand fully. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. The fisherman who had left his nets, given the keys of the kingdom, the impulsive, loud, unreliable, sometimes sinking, sometimes walking man from Capernaum, given the keys, that is the logic of grace. It has never made sense to anyone measuring by the wrong measure. And then immediately, in the same conversation, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Must, not might, not may, must. But the shadow arrived in the same breath as the blessing. The declaration of who he was followed immediately by the declaration of what that meant, what the Messiah was going to do, where the road was actually going. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. But the same Peter, who had just said, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, who had just been told he was the rock on which the church would be built, who had just been given the keys of the kingdom, who was now taking Jesus aside and telling him he was wrong about the plan. The blessing and the failure in the same moment. Peter at his most Peter. The faith and the misunderstanding arriving together, because that is how it is with Peter. The reaching and the sinking. The confession and the rebuke. Always both. Always in close proximity. Jesus turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Satan. The word fell on the group like a stone into still water. The same Peter who was the rock was the stumbling block. The same mouth that had spoken the highest confession was now speaking from the lowest understanding. Because what Peter had heard about the cross was the tragedy, the defeat, the thing that should not happen to the Messiah. But he did not understand yet that the cross was not the interruption of the mission. It was the mission. That the death was not the failure of the plan. It was the plan. He could not hold it yet. Not on the road to Caesarea Philippi. Not yet. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? But take up their cross." The disciples heard that word and felt it differently than any modern ear hears it. They had seen crucifixions. They knew what the cross was. It was a Roman instrument of execution. It was what happened to criminals and rebels. It was a death designed to be public and slow and degrading. And Jesus was saying, take it up. Not endure it if it comes, take it up, deliberately. As an act of following, the 12 stood on the road north of Galilee and felt the ground shift under the understanding of what they had signed up for. The miracles had been one thing, the teaching had been another, both extraordinary, both drawing enormous crowds, both producing the kind of momentum that felt like something building toward a visible and triumphant conclusion. And now this. Deny yourself, take up your cross, lose your life to find it. But none of them said anything. The text does not record a response, just the teaching landing in the silence of 12 men who had left their nets and their booths for this, who were now being told that the following was going to cost more than the leaving had. But John listened and felt the word arrange itself in him alongside the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount and everything that had been accumulating. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are persecuted. And now, deny yourself, lose your life. But the pattern was consistent. The kingdom kept arriving through the unexpected door, through the down, through the losing, through the place where everything the world called gain was being called something else. He did not understand it fully, but he could see the shape of it. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain by themselves. Just the three, the inner circle, the ones he had taken into the room of Jairus' daughter, who had been in the boat when he walked on the water, who were going to be with him in Gethsemane, the ones closest. And there in their presence he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, his clothes became as white as the light. And Moses and Elijah appeared talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He was from the cloud said, "This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." But when the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. The Transfiguration is one of the hardest events in the Gospel accounts to sit inside, because we are reading it from outside. The 3 disciples on the mountain were not reading about it. They were on the ground with their faces pressed into the earth because the cloud and the voice had taken them down. And then the touch. Jesus coming and touching them. "Get up. Don't be afraid." The same hand that had touched the leper, that had taken Jairus' daughter by the hand, that would reach into the sinking water for Peter, touching them now in their terror, bringing them back to the present, to the ordinary ground, to his face, which was the only face there when they looked up. The glory and the ordinary, the shining and the touch, always both. James came down from the mountain different. Not in a way he could have described, not in a way that would have been visible to someone watching him walk down the path, but something had happened on the mountain that had gone into the deepest part of him and settled there. He had seen Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets standing in conversation with the teacher. The whole weight of Israel's history gathered around this one person on a mountain in Galilee. And the voice from the cloud, "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." Listen to him. But James had been listening since the morning on the lake when he and John had climbed out of the boat and left their father. had been listening through every teaching and every miracle and every private explanation and every correction. But the voice from the cloud was different, because it was the Father's voice, the one whose name Jesus kept pointing toward, whose kingdom Jesus kept announcing, whose will Jesus kept aligning himself to, the Father who had sent the one they were following. "This is my Son." James had confessed it, had known it somewhere beneath the articulate level of confession, had understood that what they were following was more than a great teacher. But hearing the Father speak it over the shining Jesus on the mountain had done something to the knowing that was different from the inferring. He came down the mountain and looked at Jesus differently, not with more awe exactly, with a different quality of recognition, the way you look at someone when you have just been told something about them that confirms what you already suspected, but makes it realer than suspicion. But he did not say anything to the others about it. Jesus had told them not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man was raised from the dead. They kept it to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. But what rising from the dead meant. They were having that conversation on the way down from the mountain where they had seen Moses and Elijah and heard the Father's voice. They did not know. Not yet. When they came back to the other disciples, they found a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. But a man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." But the disciples had tried, had used the authority that had worked during the sending out, and it had not worked this time. "But you unbelieving generation," Jesus said, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." There is something in the frustration of that response that is human and real, the weariness in it, the how long, as though the teacher who never stopped giving was allowed to feel the weight of how much was constantly needed. He healed the boy, and the disciples asked him privately afterward why they could not drive it out. Jesus said, "This kind can come out only by prayer." But the authority was not a tool they had acquired. It was not a technique they had mastered. It was not something they carried independently and deployed when needed. It was connected to prayer, to the Father, to the source of all authority, who was the one they were following. Pray. They had learned to use the authority without maintaining the connection, had treated the power as something that now belonged to them, and had found that without the root the fruit did not come. It was a hard lesson, and a necessary one, the kind that stays because the failure stays. Because the Father and the Son and the crowd and the teachers of the law all saw the disciples not be able to do the thing they had been sent to do. It stays. And the staying of it produces the kind of humility that only failure can produce. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. The private instruction continued, away from the crowds, away from the pressing needs and the debates with the religious leaders, just the 12, and the teacher. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." But the second prediction, the same words as the first, the must be killed, the on the 3rd day raised to life. But they did not understand what he meant, and they were afraid to ask him about it, or afraid to ask. These were the men who had asked him to explain the parables, who had asked why they could not drive out the spirit, who had asked about fasting and prayer and the law and the kingdom, who had brought him their questions again and again and been answered. And now they were afraid to ask. Because somewhere in them they knew that asking would require hearing the answer again, and the answer was the cross, and the cross was not what they wanted the answer to be, and so long as they did not press the question, they could hold the hope that they had misunderstood. That the must be killed was metaphorical, that the delivered into the hands of men was a description of something other than what it sounded like. Fear can masquerade as a lot of things. Sometimes it masquerades as respect, as the decision not to trouble the teacher with unnecessary questions, as the giving of space. But the disciples were afraid, and the fear was keeping them from the understanding they needed. And the teacher, who knew what fear looked like in all its forms, said nothing about their silence. Let them carry it. knowing that the carrying of the question would do its own work in them. But the cross was coming, and they were not ready. And the not readiness was also part of the preparation. They came to Capernaum, and in the house Jesus asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But silence.br, because on the road they had argued about who among them was the greatest. Bar the prediction of the cross, the must be killed, the delivered into the hands of men, and the disciples walking the road behind him arguing about which one of them was going to be at the top of the structure they were expecting him to build. Bar Jesus sat down, called the 12, and said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." Bar he took a little child and had the child stand among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me but the one who sent me." But the child in the arms of the teacher, held up as the measure of the kingdom, not the greatest disciple, not the most impressive miracle, not the largest crowd or the most authoritative teaching or the most successful sending out, but the child, the one with no status, no leverage, no ability to advance the agenda or improve the numbers, the one the world would have moved aside. Welcome them, in my name, and you welcome me. But the 12 stood around the seated teacher holding the child and felt the particular discomfort of people who had been caught in a conversation and then had it directly addressed without the catching being named. He knew, he had known what they were arguing about, had let them arrive at the house with the argument still on them, and then held up a child. But the greatest is the one who becomes the least. The first is the one who becomes the servant of all. The kingdom has a completely different measure from the one the 12 had brought to the road argument. They were still learning. The road to the cross was teaching them things the lake and the village had not been able to teach, was pressing on the parts of them that needed pressing. John came to Jesus with a complaint. "But teacher, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us." "Do not stop him," Jesus said. "For no one who does a miracle in my name can in the next moment say anything bad about me, for whoever is not against us is for us." But John had meant well, had been protecting something, the boundary of the group, the integrity of the circle, the authority that had been given specifically to the 12. If anyone could use the name, it meant the name belonged to everyone, and if it belonged to everyone, then what was special about being in the 12? Do not stop him. The kingdom was larger than the 12, had always been larger. The circle Jesus was drawing was not the small, exclusive circle John was trying to maintain. It was wider, more permeable, less concerned with who was officially in, and more concerned with what was actually happening. John heard this and held it alongside the child in the teacher's arms. The outsider using the name, the child held up as the measure. The servant of all as the greatest. A pattern was completing itself in John's thinking, the pattern that would eventually shape the gospel he wrote and the letters he would send to the churches. The insistence on love, the wideness of the welcome, the kingdom that kept arriving in the unexpected place through the unexpected person. He was not there yet. He was still the son of thunder who had told the man to stop, who would ask for the seat at the right hand, who would suggest calling fire down, but be teaching was working on him. Slowly, the way the best formation works. Not dramatically, gradually. The shape of the heart being slowly changed by the steady pressure of the truth landing on it again and again. But he was becoming what he would eventually be, the apostle of love. Not because he had started there, because he had been loved by the one who kept showing him what love actually looked like. The shadow was falling more clearly now above BR. After Caesarea Philippi, the tone of the journey had shifted. The miracles continued, the teaching continued. But underneath it all, something had changed in the atmosphere. A direction had been named, Jerusalem, the cross, the must be killed. But Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem. Luke tells us that. He set his face, the deliberate resolution of the one who knows what is at the end of the road and walks toward it anyway, not reluctantly, not being pushed. Setting his face BR, and the disciples walked with him, not fully understanding, still arguing about greatness, still afraid to ask about the predictions, still reaching for a version of the kingdom that looked like what they had imagined when they first left the nets. But walking, still following. Peter, who had confessed the Messiah and been called Satan in the same conversation. James, who had heard the Father's voice on the mountain and come down different. John, who was slowly being changed from thunder to love. Andrew, who noticed and connected and brought without making it about himself. Matthew, who was recording everything. Thomas, who was asking questions and working out what commitment actually meant. Simon the Zealot, who was learning that the kingdom was wider than his politics. Nathanael, who had been seen under the fig tree and had never recovered from it. Bar and Judas, walking with them, carrying the common purse, present, watching, something moving in him that the others could not see, a disillusionment growing in the gap between what he had expected and what the teacher kept saying the kingdom was for. But all of them walking toward Jerusalem. But the shadow was falling, and none of them could quite see it yet. Not clearly, not with the full knowledge of what was waiting at the end of the road, but the road was going there. And the teacher had set his face, and they were following Bar into what they could not yet see. There was a conversation Jesus had with them that stayed with all of them, for he asked them questions about what was to come. He told them they would be handed over to local councils and flogged in synagogues. They would stand before governors and kings as witnesses to him. Brother would betray brother to death, a father his child. Children would rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Everyone would hate them because of him. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Stand firm. The instruction was not to be invincible, not to be unaffected, not to be without fear or grief or the very human responses to the kinds of things he was describing. The instruction was to stand firm, through it, despite it, because of the one for whom they were standing. The disciples heard this, held it, tried to fit it alongside the Beatitudes and the parables and the feeding of the 5,000 and the raising of Jairus' daughter, tried to hold together the kingdom that had felt like it was expanding into something glorious, and the predictions of betrayal and flogging and hatred. The holding together was difficult. It always is. The kingdom is not a comfortable, simple thing that resolves all tension into clarity. It holds things that are hard to hold together. The power and the cross, the glory on the mountain and the must be killed on the road, the feeding of thousands and the standing firm through hatred. The disciples were learning to hold them together, imperfectly, slowly, with the frequent failure that comes from human beings trying to comprehend something larger than human comprehension. But they were learning. And the one who was teaching them had not given up on a single one of them, was walking toward Jerusalem with his face set, knowing everything that was coming, and still choosing to bring them with him. Still choosing them. All 12. Even the one who would betray him, even the one who would deny him, even the ones who would run. Still choosing them, because that is what love does. It chooses, and keeps choosing, past the point where the choosing makes obvious sense, past the point where the return on the investment is guaranteed. He chose them, and walked toward Jerusalem, and brought them with him. Into the shadow, and through it, toward what was on the other side. The road to Jerusalem was longer than the miles. They had been walking it in one sense since Caesarea Philippi, since the must be killed and the on the third day raised had been spoken on the road heading north, and the shadow had fallen over everything that came after. Every miracle since then had been lit by it. Every teaching had been shaped by the direction they were walking. Every day had been a day closer to the city where the teacher had said the elders and chief priests and teachers of the law would deliver him to death. And yet, the disciples had not fully absorbed it, could not fully absorb it, because the information the predictions carried had nowhere to land. Dead people did not rise. Messiahs did not get killed by the religious establishment. The story they had been living for the past 3 years was expanding, was building, was gathering momentum in a direction that felt like victory. But the crowds that followed were growing. The reputation had spread far beyond Galilee. Lazarus had been raised in Bethany just outside Jerusalem. The news of it had traveled ahead of them. People were talking. People were coming out to see. The religious leaders were alarmed in a way that suggested they understood the stakes even if the disciples did not yet. And so the disciples walked the road to Jerusalem carrying two things at once: the predictions that something terrible was coming, and the momentum that felt like something glorious was about to arrive. But they held them badly. Let the momentum drown out the predictions. Let the crowd and the energy and the palm branches and the hosannas speak louder than the must be killed. They were not alone in that. It is one of the most human things in the story, the hope that speaks louder than the warning, the expectation that shapes what you hear and what you do not. But they walked toward Jerusalem, expecting the wrong thing and about to be undone by the right one. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples. "Go to the village ahead of you," he said, "and at once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." For this was done to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see your king comes to you gentle and riding on a donkey and on a colt the foal of a donkey." The donkey. Zechariah had written it 500 years earlier, the king of Israel entering the city, not on a war horse, not with an army, on a donkey, gentle. The word the prophet had chosen, gentle. The disciples who went to fetch the animals would have known the passage. It was not obscure. It was read in the synagogues. And now they were the ones fetching the donkey for the one it had been written about. But the weight of that must have sat strangely in them, the ordinary errand of going to get an animal, and the impossible scale of what the animal was for, to carry the fulfillment of a 500-year-old prophecy through the gates of Jerusalem. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them, and Jesus sat on them. For a very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road. Others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. But the crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." But the city was stirred. "Who is this?" the people of Jerusalem asked. And the crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." The prophet from Nazareth. Still not enough. Still the lesser category. But the city was stirred, and the disciples were in the middle of it, walking alongside the donkey, into the gates, into the city, into what was coming. He went into the temple courts, and he drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. "It is written," he said, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." But the disciples watched this and felt the force of it differently from the crowd, because they had seen him weep over the city, had come over the Mount of Olives and watched his face as Jerusalem came into view below and seen what happened there. The tears, the voice breaking. "If you had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes." They had seen the weeping, and now they were seeing the overturning. Both responses, both real, the grief and the anger, the tears for the city and the tables on the floor, the love that mourned and the love that drove out, not contradictions, both expressions of the same thing, the thing that is grieved by what has been done with what it loved. But the temple was supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. It had become a marketplace, the space that was meant to be the place of approach for the Gentile, the space where the outsider could come near to the God of Israel, had been filled with the commerce of religious industry. For he drove it out, with a whip of cords, alone, against the vendors and the money changers and the whole apparatus of religious commerce that had settled into the space where prayer was meant to live. And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. The temple that had been cleared was now the place of healing. The space that had been reclaimed was being used for what it was always for: the approach of the ones who needed to come, the welcome of the ones the system had kept at the margins. He cleared it, and then filled it with the right things. Every day he was teaching at the temple. The chief priests and the teachers of the law and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him, but they could not find any way to do it, because all the people hung on his words. The final days in Jerusalem before the Passover had a particular quality that the disciples felt but could not name: a tension, a compression, as though the events that had been moving through 3 years of Galilee and the roads and the lake were now being concentrated into a smaller space, a smaller time, a city, days.bar. The questions came at him in the temple, question after question from the religious leaders, testing him, trying to catch him, trap him. Find the thing, he said, that they could use. Bar, whose image is on the coin? Caesar's. Then give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. At the resurrection, whose wife will she be? You are in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God. Bar, which is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. But every trap dissolved, every testing question answered in a way that left the questioner with nothing to take hold of, and the crowd more astonished than before.br. And then he turned the questioning around. What do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? But the son of David, they said. Then how is it that David calls him Lord, he asked. But no one could say a word in reply, and from that day on no one dared to ask him any more questions. The disciples watched all of this, the escalating confrontation, the questions and the answers, the crowd and the religious leaders and the teacher in the middle of it all, speaking with the calm authority that had been present on the day in the synagogue in Capernaum when they first heard it, and had never diminished. But Bia, not for a moment had it diminished. He sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. But many rich people threw in large amounts. But a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all she had to live on. Everything she had to live on. But Andrew watched this and felt the truth of what Jesus was saying land in him differently from the way the miracles landed. Because the miracles were extraordinary. The widow was ordinary. The widow was the woman he had passed every day of his life in the villages of Galilee without looking at twice. The woman the world had categorized as having nothing to offer and therefore offering nothing that needed to be noticed. And Jesus had sat down and watched her, specifically, had noticed the 2 copper coins in the way that the crowd had not noticed them, had called his disciples over, and named what she had done as more than everything the wealthy had placed in the treasury, not because the amount was more, because the proportion was more, because she had given from nothing and they had given from surplus, because the cost to her was everything and the cost to them was comfortable. But Andrew thought about his own following, had been turning it over in a different light since the conversation about the cross and the take up your cross and follow me. The leaving of the nets had felt like a sacrifice at the time, but the nets had still been there to go back to if he had wanted to. The lake was still there, the family was still there, he had left them, but they had remained. Bar the widow had given what could not be replaced, what sustained life, everything. Bar he sat with that, and did not yet know what it would ask of him. Some Greeks came to Philip, but they had come up to worship at the festival. And they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. Sir, they said, we would like to see Jesus. But Philip went to tell Andrew. Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. The Gentiles. Coming to see Jesus. Coming through Philip because Philip had a Greek name and perhaps seemed more approachable. Coming to Andrew because Andrew was the one who brought people. The pattern of Andrew's entire following compressed into a single moment. A group of Greeks wanting to see Jesus and Andrew being the one who brought the request. Jesus said, The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. The hour. The word he had used at the wedding at Cana when his mother had told him they had no wine. My hour has not yet come, and now. The Gentiles at the door of the festival, the world arriving to see him. And Jesus saying the hour has come. Very truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. The hour of glorification was the hour of death. The glory was the cross. The producing of many seeds required the falling into the ground. But Philip heard this and felt the previous weeks of teaching rearrange themselves around it. The take up your cross. The whoever wants to save his life will lose it. The must be killed and on the 3rd day raised, and now the grain of wheat. all of it pointing the same direction, the same unavoidable direction. The way through was not around the death, it was through it. The many seeds were only possible after the one seed fell. He stood with Andrew at the edge of the conversation between Jesus and the arriving world, and understood something he had not been able to fully articulate until now. The cross was not the interruption, it was the seed. "Now my soul is troubled," Jesus said. "And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice came from heaven. "I have glorified it and will glorify it again." The crowd that was there and heard it said it had thundered. Others said an angel had spoken to him. But disciples stood in the temple courts and heard the voice, or the thunder, or the angel, and felt the same thing they had felt on the mountain when the cloud came and the Father spoke. The proximity to something that was not containable in the ordinary categories of daily experience. Jesus said, "This voice was for your benefit, not mine. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." Lifted up. He said that word and the disciples looked at each other. He had said it before. The Son of Man must be lifted up as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness. They had understood the reference. But lifting up meant crucifixion. Lifting up on the cross.br and drawing all people to myself. But the Gentiles at the gate, the widow's 2 coins, the grain of wheat falling into the ground, the lifted up on the cross, drawing all people. But the picture was assembling, piece by piece, in front of people who were still not quite able to see the whole of it, who were holding each piece separately because they could not yet find the frame large enough to hold them all together. The frame was coming, but it required the cross first, and the cross was 3 days away. Judas went to the chief priests. "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" They counted out for him 30 pieces of silver, and from then on Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. 30 pieces of silver, the price set in the law of Moses for a slave accidentally killed by an ox. The amount that the prophet Zechariah had been paid and then thrown into the temple treasury as the princely price they had set on him. 30 pieces of silver. For the one who had fed 5,000 and raised the dead and spoken with Moses and Elijah on a mountain. What happened inside Judas is one of the most examined and least fully understood things in the whole story. The Gospels give us different windows into it. John says the devil had already prompted Judas to betray Jesus. Luke says Satan entered Judas. Matthew focuses on the transaction, the 30 pieces. John also says Judas was a thief, that he kept the common purse and used to help himself to what was put into it, which suggests a pattern, a long, slow practice of small betrayals that made the large one possible, the corruption that does not arrive suddenly but builds through the repeated choice of the lesser thing over the better one. The disciples did not know. They trusted him with the purse, had trusted him for years. He sat at the table with them every night, walked the same roads, heard the same teaching.br and had already made the arrangement, while they were sleeping, while they were arguing about greatness, while they were asking Jesus to explain the parables in private. The betrayal was already in motion, the 30 pieces of silver already counted, the watching for an opportunity already begun. But the shadow was now very close. A woman came to Jesus in Bethany. While he was reclining at the table, she came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, and she poured it on his head. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they said. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." Jesus said, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Prepare me for burial. The disciples heard that, and the familiar weight of the prediction pressed down again. The must be killed, the delivered into the hands of men. And now this, the perfume poured, the preparation for burial named. The woman had understood something the disciples had not, or had not been willing to let themselves understand, that the end was close, that the days were numbered, that this moment with him was one of the last before everything changed. She had poured the perfume, an extravagant, irreplaceable, costly gift, not for a future occasion, now, because now was what was available and now was enough reason. But John watched the disciples' indignation and felt something shift in him. They had objected to the waste, the reasonable argument, the money could have gone to the poor, the practical case against the extravagant gesture, but the teacher had named it beautiful, had called it a preparation for burial, had said the story of it would be told everywhere the gospel was preached, the extravagant love that does not calculate, the gift that does not hold back waiting for the right occasion. The woman who had understood that the right occasion was now. John was learning, slowly, toward love. The Passover was 2 days away. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some sly way to arrest Jesus and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. The net was closing. The decision had been made. The question was only the how and the when, and Judas had already provided the answer to both. The disciples prepared the Passover meal. Jesus sent Peter and John ahead. "Go into the city," he said. "A man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house, the teacher asks, 'Where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs furnished and ready. Make preparations there." The preparations were ordinary, the kind of preparations the Passover required every year. The lamb, the bread, the bitter herbs, the wine, the table set, the room made ready. Peter and John made the preparations, moving through the crowded city in the days before the festival. The streets full, the pilgrims from every region, the normal chaos of Jerusalem at Passover. They found the room, made it ready, and returned to tell the others. The Last Supper was being prepared, the last Passover. The one that would not be a remembrance of Egypt, but would become the remembrance of something larger, something the disciples could not yet see coming but were hours from. Peter made the preparations without knowing what he was preparing for, thinking it was the annual meal, not knowing it was the night that would change the meaning of the meal for the rest of human history. He set the table and went back to the others, and the evening came, and they gathered in the upper room, all 12, for the last time as 12, for the last meal before everything broke. Thomas had been watching Judas, not with suspicion exactly, not with the clarity of hindsight that reads back into those days and makes it obvious what was happening, but with the particular attention of a man who watches carefully and notices the small things that other people walk past. Something had shifted in Judas in the weeks since they had come to Jerusalem. Something had changed in the quality of his presence, the way he listened at the table, the way he received the teaching. There had always been something slightly separate about him, a quality of observation that was more evaluating than receiving, of measuring rather than being shaped. But Thomas could not have named it, could not have taken it to the others and made a case. It was the kind of thing that lives below the articulable level, a texture, a temperature. He said nothing. Who was he to bring an accusation? Who was he to stand up at the table and say, "I think something is wrong with Judas"? On what grounds? On the grounds of a feeling, of a quality he could not describe. And so Thomas said nothing, watched, and carried the unease the way you carry the things you cannot name, quietly, alongside everything else. He did not know that the thing he was sensing had already found its expression, that the 30 pieces were already in a pouch somewhere, that the watching for an opportunity was already underway. He would find out in the garden. They all would. When the crowd arrived and the face at the front of it was the face of the man they had eaten with for 3 years, but that was hours away. For now the evening was gathering, and the room upstairs was ready, and the 12 were heading toward it, toward the Last Supper, toward the basin and the towel, toward the bread and the cup, toward the garden together. For the last time, as they walked toward the upper room, the city moved around them. The streets of Jerusalem at Passover were alive with the particular energy of a people remembering. The Exodus, the Lamb, the blood on the doorframes, the angel of death passing over. The long walk out of slavery into the wilderness toward the land of promise. Every year. This meal, this memory, this rehearsal of the night God had acted for his people. And this year. Were walking to the same meal, the same lamb, The same bread, the same cup but B, not knowing that the meal they were walking to would change the meaning of every meal like it that had come before and every meal like it that would follow. That the bread about to be broken would be named for a body, that the cup about to be lifted would be named for blood, that the Passover they were about to observe was the last one that looked only backward to Egypt. But this one would look forward, to the cross, to the blood of the Lamb that did not mark door frames but hearts, that did not protect one people on one night but every person in every nation for all time. They did not know that yet. They were just walking to the Passover, through the streets of Jerusalem. In the last hours before everything changed, we are all 12 together. The fisherman and the tax collector and the zealot and the questioner and the son of thunder and the one who brought people and the one who was going to betray him, all 12 walking through the streets of the city that had been stirred by their arrival a few days before, toward the upper room, toward the bread and the cup, toward the garden, toward the night that was just beginning. The shadow had arrived, and none of them knew how to be ready for what it was carrying. Barbia were walking into it, together, for the last time as 12. The room was ready, the table set, the Passover meal prepared, the lamp burning, the 12 arriving one by one and taking their places, the familiar settling of a group of men who had eaten together hundreds of times, who knew each other's habits at the table, who reached for the bread and the cup in the easy way of people for whom the sharing of a meal had become as natural as breathing. But something was different about this evening, not in the room exactly, not in any detail that could be pointed to. A quality in the air, a weight. The teacher who had spoken on the mountain and stilled the storm and raised Lazarus was quieter tonight than usual, more present in a particular way, as though every ordinary thing in the room was being seen for what it was before it was gone. But Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. John would write that later. Jesus knew. He knew what the evening was carrying, what the night beyond the meal was carrying, what the morning was carrying. And knowing all of that, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end, to the uttermost, to the full extent of what love can be and do and cost. The supper was the expression of it. The basin and the towel were the expression of it. The bread and the cup were the expression of it. The prayer he would pray before they left the room was the expression of it. He loved them to the end. And the end was hours away. He got up from the meal. Took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. He poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet. The feet of 12 men who had walked the roads of Galilee and the streets of Jerusalem. The feet of fishermen and a tax collector and a political radical. The feet of the ones who had argued about greatness on the road. The feet of the one who was about to betray him. He washed them all. He came to Simon Peter, and Peter said, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" But Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." "Unless I wash you," Jesus answered, "you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Peter, always the full gesture, always the leap from one extreme to the other, the never and then the everything, the you shall not and then the hands and head as well. But underneath the drama of the response there was something real and important. The resistance Peter felt was not arrogance exactly. It was the profound discomfort of someone who understood enough about who Jesus was to know that this was wrong, that the teacher should not be washing the feet of the students, that the Lord should not be kneeling before the servant. And Jesus said, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." But the washing was not a lesson in humility to be observed and then applied. It was the thing itself, the grace that had to be received before it could be given. The posture of the kingdom had to be accepted from the one who embodied it before it could be practiced by the ones who followed him. He washed their feet, every one of them. And then he put his outer clothing back on and returned to his place, and asked, "Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. But the basin and the towel as theology, the kneeling as instruction, the Lord on his knees before the disciples as the clearest possible picture of what the kingdom required of the ones who belong to it. But not the accumulation of power, not the claiming of position, not the argument about who was greatest that had followed them down every road from Galilee. The towel, the basin, the willingness to kneel before the person whose feet needed washing even when every measure of status and dignity said you should not be the one kneeling. John sat at the table and felt this land in him differently from how it had landed when Jesus had held the child in his arms and said the greatest must become the least, because that had been a teaching. This was a demonstration. The teacher on his knees, the water in the basin, the hands of the one who had shaped the world handling the feet of fishermen. John would spend the rest of his life returning to this image, not as a piece of historical information, as the definition of love, as the thing love does when it is not performing itself but actually being itself. This is love, the towel, the basin, the kneeling, the washing of the feet of the one who is about to betray you, the washing of the feet of the one who is about to deny you, the washing of the feet of the ones who will run, for he washed them all, and called it an example, and said, "Blessed are those who do it." It was while they were eating that Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." But they were very sad and began to say to him one after another, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord?" One after another, every one of them, "Surely not me." The question that revealed the particular quality of their self-knowledge at that table, not the certainty that they would not, the need to ask, the awareness that the answer might be yes, and the desperate hoping that it would not be. Surely not me. But John was reclining next to Jesus. Simon Peter motioned to him, "Ask him which one he means." Leaning back against Jesus. John asked, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then, dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. "What you are about to do," Jesus said to him, "do it quickly." No one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Some thought because Judas had charge of the money that Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. No one understood, even John who had asked, even John who had received the answer. The bread given to Judas. The do it quickly spoken to the one about to betray him. But they did not see it, could not hold it, the mind protecting itself from the thing it could not bear to know. But Judas took the bread and went out, and it was night. That last sentence, and it was night. John wrote it, and he meant more than the hour. The night that Judas walked into was not only the dark of the Jerusalem streets, it was the night of a choice, made and unmade, and finally made. The night of 30 pieces of silver. The night of a man walking away from the table into the dark. And it was night. After Judas had gone, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now. Where I am going, you cannot come. But a new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. But a new command. Not love your neighbor as yourself. That was old. That was Leviticus. That was the law. As I have loved you. But the measure had changed. The standard was no longer the love you already knew how to give, the love for the neighbor that required you to extend to them what you would naturally extend to yourself. That was the old measure. But the new measure was the love he had just demonstrated with the basin and the towel, the love he was about to demonstrate on the cross, the love that goes to the uttermost, that washes the feet of the one about to betray you, that gives its life for the ones who will run from the garden. As I have loved you. An impossible standard, by human measure. And that was the point. Because the love he was describing was not a human achievement, it was a participation in the love that was his nature, the fruit of abiding in him, the overflow of a life genuinely connected to the vine. Bar, they could not produce it by trying harder. They could only receive it and carry it and give it away to the next person in the same way it had been given to them. Bar, as I have loved you. Bar, the command and the provision were the same thing. He was the source of the love he was commanding them to give. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? But Jesus replied, Where I am going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. But Peter asked, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Then Jesus answered, Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Do not let your hearts be troubled. But he said it into the grief that was building in the room, into the where are you going and the you will disown me 3 times and the one of you will betray me, into the heaviness of a table where the meal was ending and the night was outside and something none of them could name was pressing on all of them. But do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. But Thomas said, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? But Thomas, asking the question, the straight-line thinker who needed the route before he could commit to the journey, we do not know where you are going. So the question of how to get there is currently unanswerable. And Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. But the answer to Thomas's question was not a map, it was a person. The way was not a route, the way was him. The truth was not a proposition, the truth was him. The life was not a state of being, the life was him. Thomas had needed to know the way before he could commit. Jesus told him that the way was the commitment, that the following was the arriving, that staying close to the one who was leading was the same as being where the leading was going. But Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. But Jesus answered, Don't you know me, Philip, even after I have been with me all this time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. But 3 years. And Philip, still reaching for something beyond the person in front of him, still looking past the one who was the answer to the question he was asking. But anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. The Father was not elsewhere. He was here, at the table, washing feet. I am the vine, you are the branches. Be. If you remain in me, and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Remain. That was the word of the upper room. Not achieve, not perform, not work harder or believe more precisely or accumulate the right spiritual credentials. Remain. Stay connected, stay near. Let the life that flows from the vine flow through the branches. Because the branches do not produce the fruit, they carry it. The source of it is the root. The branches are only ever the means by which what the root has already produced finds its way into the world. But apart from me, you can do nothing. But disciples had learned a version of this in the failed exorcism, had learned that the authority did not belong to them, that it was connected to the source, that it operated through the connection, not instead of it. But Jesus was saying the same thing now in a different register. Not just the authority, everything, the love he had just commanded, the fruit the Spirit would produce, the peace he was about to promise them, all of it, from the vine, not from the branches themselves. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. But I have told you this, so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. Joy. He was promising joy. To the men sitting in the room where the Passover meal had been eaten, and Judas had walked out into the night, and the predictions of betrayal and denial hung in the air, he was promising complete joy, not despite what was coming, through it. The joy that was not dependent on the circumstances, because it was rooted in something deeper than the circumstances, in the love, in the remaining, in the vine that did not run dry when the night pressed in. My joy. In you, complete. He lifted his eyes to heaven and prayed, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. But the high priestly prayer, the longest recorded prayer of Jesus in the Gospels, spoken in the upper room before they left for the garden, spoken for the 11 who were still there, and for the ones who would come after them, and for everyone who would ever believe through the message they were about to carry. For I have revealed you to those whom you gave me out of the world. They were yours. You gave them to me, and they have obeyed your word. But he prayed for them, by name, by category, the 11 in the room, the ones given to him, the ones he was about to leave in the world without his physical presence for the first time since the morning on the shore of the lake. But Holy Father, protect them by the power of your name, the name you gave me, so that they may be one as we are one as we are one, the unity of the Father and the Son as the pattern for the unity of the disciples. Not a human unity of agreement and consensus, the unity of the Trinity, the love that flows between the Father and the Son and the Spirit as the model for the love that flows between the ones who follow him. But my prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message. For those who will believe through their message. The prayer reached forward in time, past the garden and the cross and the empty tomb and Pentecost and the letters and the churches and the centuries, all the way to the person hearing these words right now. He prayed for you, in the upper room, before the garden, on the night of his betrayal. May they be one, Father, just as you are in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. But he prayed that you would be one with each other and one with him, that the love the Father has for the Son would be in you, but the love that existed before the world was made. In you. When he had finished praying, they went out to the Mount of Olives. To a garden called Gethsemane, which means oil press, the place where olives were crushed to produce oil. The name was not accidental. He said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and James and John, the inner three, again, the ones who had been on the mountain of the Transfiguration, now in the garden. And he began to be sorrowful and troubled. "For my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch with me." For he went a little further, fell with his face to the ground, and prayed, "Our Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." But the cup, the thing that was in the garden and would be in the next 12 hours, the weight of what was coming, the full cup of the wrath of God poured out on the sin of the world, absorbed by one person who was asking in the garden whether there was another way. He asked 3 times, came back to the 3 each time to find them sleeping. "Could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "But watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The flesh is weak." He said it without condemnation, not as an accusation against the sleeping disciples, as a description, a recognition. The flesh is weak. This is what human beings are. This is the material he was working with. This is why the cross was necessary, because the flesh could not sustain what the Spirit wanted. 3 times the prayer, 3 times the return to the sleeping disciples, 3 times the finding of them unable to hold the watch. And then the sound of the crowd arriving through the olive trees. And Judas at the front. Judas arrived with a crowd armed with swords and clubs. Sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Torches in the dark. The sound of many feet through the garden. The particular quality of a crowd that has come for a specific purpose and knows what it is. Judas had given them a signal. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." He went directly to Jesus. "Greetings, Rabbi," he said, and kissed him. "But friend," Jesus replied, "do what you came for." Friend. The word landed on Judas like something he had not prepared himself to hear. He had prepared for many things, had walked through the conversation in his mind, the signal, the kiss, the arrest, the handing over. He had prepared. He had not prepared for friend. The one he was betraying, naming him as a friend in the moment of the betrayal. Not with bitterness, not with accusation, with the same quality of relationship that had been present at the table and on the roads and in the boats and through 3 years of eating together and walking together and being formed together. Friend. The disciples who were around Jesus saw what was happening. One of them drew a sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said. For all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But he healed the ear in his arrest. The hand that reached for the hurting one reached even in the moment of being taken, even the man who had come to arrest him. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. All of them, every one, the ones who had said, I will never leave you, the one who had said, I will lay down my life for you, the inner three who had been in the garden with him, all of them running into the dark bar, and Jesus was led away. Alone, Peter followed bar at a distance. The detail matters. He did not run with the others. He could not bring himself to run, could not walk away entirely, but could not get close either. So he followed. The way you follow when you are afraid and ashamed of the fear, and not yet ready to be the person the fear is making you, bar at a distance. Into the courtyard of the high priest, where a fire was burning, and people were gathered around it for warmth, and a servant girl looked at him. But you also were with Jesus of Galilee, she said. But he denied it before he knew he had spoken. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, Dog-1. But he moved to the gateway. Another servant girl saw him. This man was with Jesus of Nazareth, and he denied it with an oath. I don't know the man, Br. After a little while, those standing there came up to Peter. Surely you are one of them, your accent gives you away. But he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, I don't know the man, bar. And immediately a rooster crowed, bar. And Jesus turned and looked straight at Peter, bar. That look, Peter met it across the courtyard, the eyes of the one he had confessed as the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the one he had said, I will lay down my life for you, looking at him from across the courtyard fire. And Peter went outside and wept bitterly. But the weeping was not a performance. It was not the grief of a man who had failed a test and was unhappy about his score. It was the grief of a man who had just seen himself clearly, who had said I would never and had discovered that the never was closer than he thought, who had denied the one he loved most in the moment the one he loved most needed him most. He went outside and wept. The 11 were scattered, bar, each one somewhere in the dark of Jerusalem, behind closed doors, in the corners of borrowed rooms, in the silence of people who had just watched the thing they had built their lives on for 3 years be arrested and led away. 11 men who had left their nets and their booths and their fig trees and their political commitments and their homes, who had walked the roads of Galilee, who had distributed bread that multiplied and seen the dead raised and heard the Father's voice from the cloud, who had been given the keys of the kingdom and the commission to go to all nations, but are scattered, hiding, afraid, bar. And somewhere in the city Judas was walking with 30 pieces of silver and the particular quality of silence that follows a point of no return. The silence of a man who has done the thing and cannot undo it, who has crossed a line and is standing on the other side of it and finding that the other side is nothing like he thought. And Peter somewhere near the courtyard with the bitter weeping not yet finished, with the rooster's sound still in his ears, with the look of Jesus still in his memory. The look that had not been accusation, had been something worse and better than accusation, had been recognition. The look of someone who had seen this coming and loved him anyway. The 12 were not 12 anymore. Judas had walked into the night. The 11 had scattered. Bar, the one who had chosen them all, who had washed their feet and prayed for them and promised them complete joy and told them, I will come back for you, was now in the hands of the chief priests. But the night was not finished. Bar, the worst of it was still ahead, Br, and none of them were ready. Not one of them had been able to stay awake in the garden. Not one of them had stood in the courtyard. Not one of them had been able to hold the watch that the teacher had asked them to hold. But they were in the dark, scattered, exactly as the scripture had said they would be. Strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. The shepherd had been struck. And the sheep were scattered in the dark of Jerusalem, waiting for a morning that would first have to pass through the worst day any of them had ever lived. The night moved through its stages without waiting for anyone to be ready. But the arrest in the garden, the binding, the leading away through the olive trees and out of Gethsemane and through the dark streets of Jerusalem to the house of the high priest, the trials that would follow, the moving from one authority to another, Annas to Caiaphas to Pilate to Herod and back to Pilate, the whole machinery of religious and political power being applied to one man in the hours before dawn, and the 11 somewhere in the city, in the dark. Scattered, Bobby. We do not know exactly where most of them were in those hours. The Gospels do not track all of them through the night. They follow Jesus through the trials and the betrayal and the denial and the cross. The disciples appear and disappear from the account, the way people appear and disappear from a scene that is not primarily about them, but they were somewhere, each one of them, in some room or some corner of the city or some quiet stretch of road, carrying the weight of what had just happened. The garden, the crowd, the swords and the torches, the face of Judas at the front of the crowd, the running, the scattering into the dark. Bar and the knowledge pressing on each of them in different ways, that the one they had followed for 3 years was in the hands of the people who wanted him dead, that the miracles and the teaching and the must be killed had arrived at its destination, that the road they had walked from the lake in Galilee to Jerusalem had led here, to this night, to this bar, each of them carrying it differently, because they were 12 different people who had come from different places and followed for different reasons and understood differently what they had been following, but all of them in the dark, waiting for a morning none of them knew how to prepare for. Peter was the one who had followed Bar at a distance, into the courtyard, to the fire, through the denials and the rooster and the look across the courtyard and the weeping outside. After the weeping, the text does not immediately tell us where Peter went. He disappears from the account for a while, which in itself tells you something about the state he was in. The man who had been the loudest, the most present, the one always at the front of the group, gone quiet, gone somewhere. The weeping had not resolved anything. It was not the grief that leads quickly to a plan of action. It was the grief of a man who had seen himself with complete clarity and did not like what he saw, who had made the declaration at the table, "I will lay down my life for you," and had found that the declaration came apart at the question of a servant girl. Not a soldier, not a religious authority, not someone with power over him, a servant girl by the gate, and he had denied, quickly, before the fear had finished arriving. He sat somewhere in Jerusalem with the rooster still sounding in his ears, with the look of Jesus still in his memory, and the weeping not finished by a long way. He would carry this for days, through the cross and the burial and the silence of Saturday, would carry it all the way to a beach in Galilee, where a charcoal fire would be burning and a voice would ask him 3 times, "Do you love me?" But that was ahead. In the hours after the garden, what Peter carried was the weight of the man who had run, who had followed at a distance, who had sat at the fire with the people who had come to arrest Jesus and said, "I don't know the man." That was what Peter carried through the night. And the day that was coming, John was at the cross. Of all the disciples, John is the one the gospel accounts place at the cross, the son of thunder, the one who had asked to sit at the right hand in the kingdom, the one who had wanted to call fire down on the Samaritan village, there at the cross. Not at a distance, not watching from the edge of the crowd, there, close enough to hear the words spoken from the cross, close enough to see the darkness come at noon, close enough to watch the moment. He had not run, or had run and come back. Something in John had been unable to stay away. Maybe it was the particular quality of the love that was forming in him, the love that the basin and the towel and the vine and the branches had been producing in him through the months and years of following, the love that does not calculate risk before it decides whether to stay. He stood at the foot of the cross, beside Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the other women, in the place where the courage to be present outweighed the fear of being identified. And Jesus looked down from the cross, and saw his mother, and saw the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. "Woman, here is your son," he said to Mary. And to John he said, "Here is your mother." From the cross. In the middle of everything the cross was carrying, the physical agony, the darkness, the weight of the sin of the world, he looked down and saw his mother standing at the foot with nowhere to go and no one to care for her. And he gave her to John. And from that hour John took her into his own home. From that hour, while the cross was still happening, John received her and took responsibility for her. The Son of Thunder, standing at the foot of the cross, taking the mother of Jesus into his home, being given a mother, being given a family, by the one dying above him. That is the love that does not calculate. Present when presence costs everything. Receiving what is given in the hardest moment. Staying. The women were there. Bar Mary Magdalene. Mary, the mother of James and Joses, the mother of Zebedee's sons, Salome. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee and supported him out of their own means, who had been present through the ministry in the way that often goes unrecorded because the culture did not count them among the ones worth recording. They were at the cross. Bar when the disciples scattered in the garden, the women had not scattered in the same way. They stood at a distance watching, unable to leave, unable to look away. Their love for the one on the cross, not calculating the cost of being seen there. They had served him, had provided for the movement, had listened to the teaching, had followed when the road went difficult, and now they were standing in the group of people, not running from the cross but standing before it. The church would later remember them as the first witnesses of the resurrection, the first to arrive at the tomb, the first to hear the news, the first to be sent to tell. That sequence is not accidental. The ones who stayed at the cross were the ones who were first at the tomb. The ones who did not run were the ones who were first to receive what the running had almost cost the others. Mary Magdalene, who had had 7 demons cast out of her, who had followed since Galilee, who had stood when others had gone, who would stand outside the tomb weeping when everyone else had gone back to wherever they were staying, who would hear her name spoken in the garden by the one she thought was the gardener. She was at the cross, while it was still happening, while the darkness covered the land, while the words were being spoken from above. She did not leave, could not leave. But that is what love looks like when it has nothing left but the being there. It was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. But the soldiers divided his clothes by casting lots, the charge written above his head. "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." The 2 criminals on either side, the crowd passing and hurling insults, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocking him. "But he saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe." The taunt was built on a misunderstanding. He could have come down. The authority that had driven out Legion, that had raised Lazarus, that had commanded the wind and the waves was still present. The power had not been taken from him. He was choosing not to use it. Because coming down was not the mission. Staying was the mission. Staying until everything that needed to be accomplished was accomplished, until the cup had been drunk to the last drop, until the debt that had accumulated since the garden was fully absorbed. From noon darkness came over all the land. For 3 hours. And at 3 in the afternoon Jesus cried out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But the women at the foot of the cross heard it. John heard it. The darkness pressed down over the hill outside Jerusalem, and the words of Psalm 22 came from the one who was the reason Psalm 22 had been written. And then, after the vinegar on the hyssop, after the "I am thirsty," he is finished, and he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. The curtain of the temple tore from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, the tombs broke open. And the centurion who had watched everything that had happened said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." The man who had overseen the crucifixion, saying it, at the cross, while the disciples who had walked with Jesus for 3 years were hidden somewhere in the city. The cross had a way of revealing what was in people, even in the ones who had no reason to expect what they found there. Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate. He was a rich man, a member of the Sanhedrin, a secret disciple of Jesus, who had not consented to the decision of the council but who had not found the courage to say so publicly until now, after the cross, when there was nothing left to gain and everything still to lose, when the teacher was dead and the disciples had scattered and the religious establishment had gotten what it wanted. Now Joseph found his courage. He asked for the body. Pilate granted it, and Joseph took it, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in his own new tomb cut from the rock, and rolled a large stone against the entrance. Bar Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting opposite the tomb, watching as the stone was rolled across, watching the entrance sealed. The next day the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. That deceiver said, "After 3 days I will rise again. Make the tomb secure." "Take a guard," Pilate said. "Make it as secure as you know how. Bar as secure as you know how." They sealed the stone and posted the guard. But the disciples somewhere in the city did not know about the guard, did not know that the religious leaders had remembered the prediction they themselves had not been able to hold, that the ones who wanted Jesus dead had taken the resurrection more seriously as a possibility than the ones who had loved him. The tomb was sealed, the guard was posted, and Jerusalem moved into the Sabbath, into the silence. And the disciples were somewhere in the dark of the city, having lost the thing around which their whole lives had been reorganized for 3 years, having run from the garden, having denied and scattered and hidden, carrying the weight of what they had done and what had been done to the one they loved. Saturday was coming, and Saturday was going to be the longest day any of them had ever lived. We have no record of what Saturday was like for the disciples. The Gospels do not give us a Saturday account. They move from the burial on Friday to the early morning of Sunday, from the stone rolled across to the stone rolled away, from the sealed tomb to the folded grave clothes. Saturday exists in the Gospel accounts as a silence, a gap, a day with no reported words and no recorded events, just the implied reality of 11 men somewhere in Jerusalem carrying the weight of everything that had happened. We know from John that at some point they were together, behind locked doors, because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, a room locked. 11 men in the wreckage of what they had believed. We can imagine, not everything, but something. We can imagine Peter sitting in the room and not speaking, the man who always spoke not speaking, the rooster still sounding somewhere in the back of his mind, the look of Jesus across the courtyard still in his memory, the "I will lay down my life for you" hanging in the air between what he had said and what he had done. We can imagine Thomas reviewing the evidence, the way Thomas always did, building the case, trying to find the line of logic that connected everything he had seen and heard to what had happened in the garden and at the cross, looking for the framework that could hold the miracle of the feeding and the raising of Lazarus and the "I am the resurrection" and the life alongside the darkness at noon and the "it is finished" and the stone rolled across the entrance. But the framework did not come, could not come yet, because the category that would make sense of everything was not yet available. The third day had not come. Saturday does not know about Sunday. That is the hardest thing about Saturday. It feels final. It feels like the last chapter. It feels like the answer to every question about whether the following had been worth it. And the answer Saturday gives is the worst answer. And Saturday was all they had. For a whole day and a whole night, Judas knew what Saturday felt like. He had gone back to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That is your responsibility." He threw the money into the temple and went away and hanged himself. But the chief priests picked up the coins. "It is against the law to put this into the treasury since it is blood money," they said. And they decided to use it to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. The field was called the Field of Blood. Judas had gone back to the only people who knew what he had done, the ones who had benefited from it, who had given him the 30 pieces, looking for something, we do not know exactly what. Absolution, possibly. Some acknowledgement that they shared the responsibility, some loosening of the weight that had settled on him the moment the thing was done. What is that to us? That is your responsibility. No loosening, no sharing. He had been useful to them, and now he was not useful, and what he had done was entirely his responsibility, and they were done with him. He threw the money into the temple. The 30 pieces, counted out at the beginning, thrown away at the end, and the field bought with the price of blood. The disciples did not know what had happened to Judas on Saturday. They would find out later. Would learn that the man who had walked out into the night had not returned to the chief priest to undo what he had done, but had found the weight of it impossible to carry, and had not found his way to the one who could have carried it for him, for the one who might have forgiven him. Had he come back? Had he done what Peter did? gone out and wept and not gone further than the weeping. Bar Judas and Peter. Both had failed. Both had betrayed the teacher in different ways. One went out and wept. One went away and could not come back. The difference between them was not the failure. It was what they did with the failure. Andrew sat with the silence. He was the quieter of the brothers, the one who noticed and connected and brought, rather than the one who led and spoke. And in the silence of Saturday, he was the one who sat with what he knew. He had been the first among the 12 to follow, had spent a day with Jesus before he brought Simon, had heard the rabbi ask, "What do you want?" and had answered with a question of his own. "Where are you staying? Come and see." He had stayed, had seen, had spent 3 years seeing .br, and now the one he had seen was in a sealed tomb with a Roman guard outside it. And the predictions that he must die and on the third day rise were sitting in Andrew's memory alongside everything else he had seen and heard, alongside the feeding and the storm and the legion and Lazarus. Bar he had seen Lazarus, had been there in Bethany when Jesus had wept, and then said, "Lazarus, come out," and the dead man had walked through the door of the tomb in his burial clothes. He had seen that bar. And somewhere in the Saturday silence, Andrew held that. Held the Lazarus alongside the sealed tomb. Held the "I am the resurrection and the life" alongside the "it is finished." Not resolved, not with the certainty of a man who had already figured out what Sunday morning was going to look like, but holding. The way you hold something you do not fully understand but cannot put down, because there is too much in it to release. He was the quieter brother. He did not say this to anyone in the room. The others were carrying what they were carrying, and there was no framework yet for what he was holding to be received up, but he held it, through Saturday, quietly, the way Andrew held things, and waited for what he did not yet know was coming. The women were preparing spices and perfumes. Br to complete the burial preparation that the Sabbath had interrupted. Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, Salome, gathered the spices, preparing to go to the tomb as soon as the Sabbath was over, as soon as the first light made the journey possible. They were not preparing for a resurrection, they were preparing for a burial completion, the practical love of women doing the last thing available to do for the one they had followed, when everything else was impossible, when the cross was done and the stone was sealed and the world had moved on to its next concern. They were doing this, bringing spices for a body. The disciples behind the locked door were not planning to go to the tomb, were not making preparations, were in the particular suspension of people whose world has ended and who have not yet found the next thing to organize themselves around. The women were already moving toward the tomb. In the darkness before dawn, with the spices, not expecting anything except the guards and the sealed stone and the work they had come to do. That posture, the showing up when there is nothing left to expect, the doing of the last available thing out of love with no anticipation of return, the bringing of spices to a sealed tomb in the dark before dawn. That is the posture that was in the right place when the world changed. Not the disciples behind the locked door, not the guards at the tomb, the women with the spices walking in the dark. Love that shows up anyway, when there is nothing left to hope for by the world's measure. That love was walking toward the tomb, and the tomb was not going to be what they expected. Matthew sat in the locked room and thought about the prophecies he had been recording. From the beginning, the careful attention of the man who kept accounts, writing down the teaching, connecting the events to the scripture, building the case that had been building in him since the first day at the booth. He thought about the betrayal for 30 pieces of silver, had read in Zechariah about the 30 pieces thrown into the temple, had now watched it happen. The counting out and the handing over and Judas throwing the money back into the temple courts. He thought about the entry into Jerusalem on the donkey, had read in Zechariah about the king coming gentle and riding on a donkey, had walked alongside the borrowed animal into the gates of the city. He thought about the soldiers gambling for the clothes, had read in the 22nd Psalm about dividing garments and casting lots. He thought about the cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The first line of the same psalm. He thought about the vinegar on the hyssop, the bones not broken, the side pierced. Every detail of the cross had been written, centuries before, in the Psalms and the prophets and the law, written in the way that a story is written before it is lived, by someone who could see the ending before the beginning had started. Matthew sat in the locked room and built the case in his mind, not with the peace of someone who had resolved the grief, but with the growing unease of a man who recognized the pattern, who had seen too many of the details land exactly where the scripture had placed them to believe the script was finished. The third day had been mentioned, more than once. On the road to Caesarea Philippi, on the road through Galilee, on the third day raised to life. Bar Matthew sat with a pattern and waited for the third day. Saturday ended. But the Sabbath gave way to the first day of the week. The city slept. The guards at the tomb kept their watch. The disciples in the locked room carried the long silence into the dark beyond midnight, and the women with their spices waited for enough light to make the journey. Bore the silence of Saturday, a full day of it. God put it there, between the death and the resurrection, between the "it is finished" and the Mary spoken in the garden, a whole day of grief and hiding and the weight of the cross and the failed predictions and the scattered disciples and the weeping Peter and the lost Judas. The silence was not wasted. Nothing in this story is wasted. The silence of Saturday was doing its own work in the ones who were carrying it, pressing on the places that needed pressing, producing the particular quality of emptiness that can only be filled by the thing that comes next, not the filling that comes from comfort or resolution or the gradual easing of grief. The filling that comes when the thing you had stopped being able to believe in walks through a locked door and says, "Peace be with you." Boy, they needed Saturday. The grief and the failure and the silence needed to be fully present before the Sunday could arrive, because the Sunday would not make sense without the Saturday. The resurrection would not be understood without the death. The "peace be with you" would not have the weight it needed without the "you will disown me" 3 times that had come before it. But Saturday was part of the story. A necessary part, a painful part, but not the last part. The stone was sealed, the guards were posted, the women were waiting for the light. The disciples were behind the locked door. Br, and the third day was coming, had always been coming, was hours away now. At Bar, and the God who had put Saturday in the story had always known what Sunday was carrying. The silence was almost over. The stone was about to move. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. But not yet the others, not yet Peter and John running, not yet the locked room opening, just Mary, in the dark before the dawn, with the spices and the love that shows up even when there is nothing left to hope for. She saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. She ran to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. And she said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." But her first interpretation was theft. Someone has moved the body, not resurrection, not the fulfillment of everything he had said, because resurrection was outside the available categories, because dead people do not rise, because the most fundamental rule of human experience is that what is dead stays dead. Peter and John ran. John outran Peter and reached the tomb first, bent over and looked in, saw the strips of linen lying there, did not go in, but Peter arrived and went straight in. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head lying separately, folded up by itself, in a place by itself. Folded up, not hurled aside, not scattered in the rush of a theft, folded, carefully, deliberately, as though whoever had left had taken their time, had not been rushed by anyone or anything. A stolen body is not folded. Grave robbers do not pause to fold the burial cloth. The folded linen was not the sign of a hurried departure. It was the sign of an orderly one, of something that had simply and completely finished with what it no longer needed. John saw and believed, but not yet fully understood. But believed. The folded cloth was enough for John. The detail that nobody invents because nobody invents the incidental. The folded cloth that sits in the Gospel of John like a fingerprint. The small, undeniable sign that something had happened here that theft could not explain. They went back to where they were staying. And Mary stood outside the tomb crying. Everyone else had gone. The disciples had come and seen and gone back, and Mary stood there, weeping, still, alone at the entrance to the empty tomb with nowhere to go because the only place she wanted to be was wherever he was, and she did not know where that was. But she bent over to look into the tomb, and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and one at the foot. But they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "But they have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." But she turned around and saw someone standing there, but she did not realize it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" But thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." He was going to carry him, alone, whatever it took. And Jesus said one word, Mary, her name, the specific name. In the voice she had heard hundreds of times, in the inflection she knew, the way he had always said it, Bar, and she turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni, teacher, the risen Jesus." And the first person he appeared to was not Peter, not John, not James or Andrew or any of the inner circle. Mary Magdalene, the woman from whom 7 demons had been cast out, the one who had stood at the cross when others fled, the one who had come in the dark before dawn, because love does not stop showing up just because the one it loves appears to be gone. For he said her name, and she knew him. But he still says names, he still finds the ones who are looking for him in the dark, and he still knows exactly how to say a name, so that the one hearing it knows immediately it is him. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "Br, I have seen the Lord." And she told them what he had said. But the disciples heard it and did not know what to do with it, because grief does not immediately reorganize itself around good news, because the 3 days had been 3 very long days, because the locked room and the fear and the weight of the cross and the Saturday silence had settled into them in a way that a woman's report of seeing the teacher in a garden had not yet dislodged. That evening the disciples were together, behind locked doors, because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. And Jesus came and stood among them. Through the locked door, through the sealed room, through the fear and the grief and the locked everything that they had put between themselves and the world since the garden. He came and stood among them. And said, "Peace be with you." Peace, the word they needed most, the word that addressed the specific condition they were in. Not be brave or well done or I understand. Peace, the settling of the thing that had been unsettled since the garden, the stilling of the storm that had been building since the torches came through the olive trees. He showed them his hands and his side. The wounds still there, in the resurrection body, not erased, not healed over, still present, still visible, still real. The resurrection did not erase the cross, it vindicated it. The wounds were not embarrassments, they were the evidence of the love that went all the way, the marks that would be present forever on the hands of the Son of God, the scars that purchased everything. And the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. The locked room had held fear and grief, now it held joy. The same room, different contents, because he was in it now, and his presence changed what was possible in the room he occupied. I am sending you. Thomas was not with the disciples when Jesus came, but we do not know where he was, only that he was not there, not in the locked room, somewhere else, in the city, carrying what Saturday had given him and what Sunday had not yet given him, because he had not been present when it was given. When the others told him, "We have seen the Lord," Thomas said, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." 2,000 years of doubting Thomas. 2,000 years of that label following him from that sentence. But look at what the sentence actually is. It is the statement of a man who has set a standard for evidence and is being honest about it, who is not pretending to believe what he does not believe, who is not performing faith he does not have, who is saying clearly and directly, "Here is what I would need. Here is the evidence that would be sufficient." That is Thomas. The straight line. The "I need to understand before I can commit." The "show us the Father and that will be enough" at the Last Supper. The "we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way?" Thomas, who needed the route before the journey and the evidence before the belief. A week later, the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them this time. And Jesus came again, through the locked doors, and stood among them. And he said, "Peace be with you." And then he turned to Thomas. "Put your finger here. See my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. But he had heard, had known what Thomas said when he was not there, had come back specifically for Thomas, not with rebuke, not with a lecture on the weakness of his faith, with exactly the evidence Thomas had asked for. But Thomas looked at the hands and said, "My Lord and my God." By the highest confession in all four Gospels, from the mouth of the man history called the doubter, Jesus said to Thomas, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Bar that blessing reaches forward in time, past the upper room and the wounds and Thomas's hand and the locked doors, all the way to the person who lives 2,000 years from Jerusalem and has not seen the wounds or heard the voice or been in the room when he came through the locked door. Bar, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. The 11 had seen, had touched, had heard the peace be with you, and watched the wounds on his hands, had been given the direct, unmediated encounter with the risen Jesus. The blessing Jesus spoke over Thomas was not for Thomas. Thomas had seen. The blessing was for the ones who would not see, who would hear the message the disciples were about to carry, who would read the accounts Matthew and John and the others would eventually write, who would encounter the risen Jesus not through physical sight, but through the testimony of those who had seen. Bar, that is the chain. The disciples who saw witness to those who have not seen, and those who believe without seeing receive the blessing Jesus pronounced in the upper room. Be blessed, not second best, not the lesser faith of the ones who couldn't be there. Blessed, specifically named, by the one who was preparing to send the 11 out to produce exactly that kind of faith in exactly that kind of person. The mission was already in it. The Great Commission was already present in the blessing over Thomas. Go, tell, and the ones who have not seen and yet believe will be blessed. That blessing is still being given to every person who hears and believes without having stood in the upper room, still being given right now. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee, the lake. They had come back to the lake, to the water that had been their world before the calling, to the boats and the nets and the familiar rhythms of the only life they had known before 2 words had changed the direction of everything. But Simon Peter said, "I am going out to fish." "We will go with you," they said. They went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was him. But he called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. "But throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." But they threw it, and were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. But the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." John, who had outrun Peter to the tomb, who had stood at the foot of the cross, who had taken Mary into his own home from that hour, looking at the figure on the shore and knowing him before anyone else. "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard this, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. Peter, who had denied him 3 times, who had wept bitterly and gone somewhere in the city and carried the weight of the courtyard through all the days since, who had run to the empty tomb and gone straight in and seen the folded cloth, heard it is the Lord, and jumped into the water, not wading in carefully, not rowing in with the others, jumping, the full commitment, the full Peter, the always most or least, the sinking and walking, the never and then the hands and head, the I will lay down my life and then the I don't know the man, and now the jumping, are into the water, toward the shore, toward the fire, toward the Lord. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught. Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. The God of the resurrection, cooking breakfast on a beach for tired fishermen who had been out all night and caught nothing. This is who he is. Not only the Lord of the upper room appearances and the glorious commission to go to all nations, also the one who has a fire going and food ready when his friends get to shore, who notices that the people he loves have been up all night and are cold and hungry, come and have breakfast. Bar the cosmic and the ordinary, the resurrection and the fish, the conquered death and the charcoal fire on a beach in the early morning. Always both, never one without the other. Bar Peter ate at that fire and felt the particular weight of charcoal fires in his life, because the last charcoal fire he had sat at was the courtyard, the warming of himself while inside the high priest's house Jesus was being questioned. The fire he had sat at when the servant girl had asked and he had said, "I don't know the man." Now another charcoal fire, on a beach in Galilee, with the risen Lord cooking breakfast on the other side of it. Bar the same smell, the same warmth, a different morning. Bar Peter ate and waited, because something in the atmosphere of the morning told him that the breakfast was not all that was coming, that the fire was for more than warmth, that the man across it was going to say something that would address the thing Peter had been carrying since the rooster crowed. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" But not Peter, Simon, the name before the calling, the name before the rock, son of John, as though they were starting from the beginning, from the person Peter had been before the nets and the water and the confession and the denial. "Yes, Lord," Peter said, "you know that I love you, but feed my lambs." Br again the second time he said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said, "you know that I love you, but take care of my sheep." But the third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" But Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, and he said, "Lord, you know all things, you know that I love you. But feed my sheep." But 3 questions, for 3 denials. 3 times the rooster had crowed, answered by 3 times the question asked. Not to punish, not to make Peter relive the courtyard in public, to restore, to give him 3 opportunities to say out loud in the morning light at a beach fire what had been in his heart all along, and what the fear in the courtyard had buried under 3 denials. "Do you love me?" Peter said yes, 3 times, with everything he had, in the daylight, at the beach, after the breakfast. Br and the restoration was complete. The denials were answered, the weeping was resolved, not forgotten, resolved. The thing that had broken in the courtyard was being made whole at the fire. But Jesus did not restore Peter to leadership by reviewing his qualifications, or by requiring a period of probation, or by making him earn back the trust. He asked about his heart. "Do you love me?" And Peter said yes, and that was enough. It is always enough. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days. Br to Mary Magdalene first, then to the disciples behind locked doors, then to Thomas specifically, then at the beach, to the 2 on the road to Emmaus who did not recognize him until he broke the bread, to more than 500 people at once, to James his brother, to Paul on the road to Damascus years later, still appearing, still undeniably present. He spoke to them about the kingdom of God. He opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures, showed them how everything in the law and the prophets and the Psalms had been written about him. The cross was not the interruption, it was the center. The moment everything the scripture had been building toward arrived and accomplished what it had been promised to accomplish. The disciples who had not been able to hold the predictions before the cross were now able to hold them, because the thing that made them incomprehensible was gone. The death that should not have happened to the Messiah had happened, and the resurrection that seemed impossible had happened, and the scripture that had seemed to point toward something had pointed exactly here. Their minds were opened, not all at once, not in a single moment of revelation, but through 40 days of the risen Jesus explaining, showing the connections, walking them through the Psalms and the prophets and the law with the eyes they now had, because the cross and the resurrection had given them the framework that the cross and the resurrection had previously seemed to destroy. They were ready now for what was coming, not fully, not in the way that would only become possible when the Spirit fell, but ready in a different way than the men behind the locked door on Saturday had been ready. They had seen him, they had heard the peace be with you, they had eaten the breakfast. Thomas had said, "My Lord and my God." Peter had said yes 3 times at the fire. They were ready to be sent. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Some doubted. Even then, even in the presence of the risen Lord on the mountain in Galilee, after 40 days of appearances and the opening of their minds, some doubted. The gospel does not hide this, does not tidy it up, does not smooth over the complexity of what faith looks like in actual human beings, even in the most extraordinary circumstances. Some doubted. And Jesus came to them and spoke, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." All authority, not some, not the authority over sickness and death and the natural world that they had watched him exercise for 3 years. All authority, in heaven and on earth, the full scope, the complete sovereignty. Nothing outside it. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Go, make disciples, all nations, the fisherman and the tax collector and the zealot and the questioner and the quiet connector and the son of thunder, standing on a mountain in Galilee, being given a commission to go to all nations. The scope of it was impossible by any calculation available to 11 people standing on a hillside. All nations, with what resources, with what infrastructure, with what plan. And I am with you always, Jesus said. To the very end of the age, I am with you always. The commission and the presence together, the impossible scope of the mission and the unlimited availability of the one giving it. Go, and I am with you always, to the very end of the age. Not until the mission gets difficult, not until the resources run out, not until the disciples have given everything they have to give. Always. He led them out to the vicinity of Bethany. Lifted up his hands and blessed them. And while he was blessing them, he left them and was taken up into heaven. The ascension. The visible departure of the Son of God from the earth, not a fading or a disappearing, a being taken up into heaven while they watched, while his hands were still raised in blessing over the people he was leaving. He'd last posture toward them, not a farewell that turned away, a farewell that stayed turned toward them until he was out of sight. The hands raised, the blessing still being given as he left, the benediction still in the air over the hillside. And they stood there looking up into the sky. 2 men in white appeared beside them. "Men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. He is coming back." Not a metaphor, not a gradual improvement in human conditions described as the coming of the kingdom. This same Jesus, the one whose hands were raised in blessing as he left, coming back in the same way. And they returned to Jerusalem with great joy. Great joy, not grief, not the heavy parting sorrow of people who have just watched the one they love disappear into the sky. Great joy. Because the ascension was not a loss, it was a repositioning. He was not gone. He was in a new place, interceding, preparing, present in a way that the physical body and the physical location had actually limited. The Spirit he was about to send would put him in every place at once, in every believer, in every nation, to the ends of the earth. He had not left. He had become more present. And they went back to Jerusalem and waited. They returned to Jerusalem and went upstairs to the room where they were staying. Peter, John, James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas son of James, 11 names. The list that had always had 12 now had 11. They joined together constantly in prayer, along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. About 120 people in total, together, waiting, as they had been told to wait. They did not know exactly what was coming. He had said, "Wait for the gift the Father promised. You will be baptized with the Holy Spirit not many days from now." He had said, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." The ends of the earth. Standing in an upper room in Jerusalem, 120 people, waiting. The gap between the commission and the capacity was the full width of the world. But they waited, together, in prayer, the way he had told them to, without knowing what the gift looked like or when it would arrive or what it would do to them or whether they would recognize it when it came. Bar they waited, the fisherman and the tax collector and the zealot and the ones whose names history barely recorded. The women who had stood at the cross and come first to the tomb, Mary, the mother of Jesus. The brothers who had not believed during the ministry and were now in the room .br together, waiting, praying .br, and the Spirit was coming, was days away, was being poured out on the generation that had walked the roads of Galilee, and the movement that would start in that upper room and would carry the name of the one who had been raised from the dead to the ends of the earth was about to begin. The ends of the earth, that the 11 could not yet imagine, that the 120 could not yet see, was already in the promise, already in the commission, already written in the hands that had been raised in blessing over their heads on the hillside outside Bethany, already his, already coming. The wait was almost over. The wait ended on the day of Pentecost. They were all together in one place, the 120, the 11 and the women and Mary and the brothers of Jesus, together, waiting as they had been told to wait, not passively, together in prayer, in the active waiting that knows something is coming and holds itself open to receive it. And suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit enabled them. But the sound and the fire and the languages, creation responding to the promise being kept, the wind that had moved over the waters at the beginning now moving through an upper room in Jerusalem, the fire that had descended on Sinai now resting on 120 ordinary people, the languages that had been scattered at Babel now flowing from the same room in a reversal that pointed at the scope of what was beginning. For a crowd gathered, people from every nation under heaven drawn by the sound, each one hearing the wonders of God declared in their own language, their own tongue, the mother language of the country they had come from. Bar. And Peter stood up, the same Peter who had run from the garden, who had denied 3 times at the charcoal fire, who had wept bitterly outside the courtyard, who had jumped into the water when John said, "It is the Lord," who had said yes 3 times at the beach fire, who had watched the hands raised in blessing disappear into the sky. Peter stood up and preached. Br, and 3,000 people were baptized that day. Bar the one who had denied now declared, the one who had run now stood firm. The Spirit had done what the 3 years of following had been building toward, and the movement that would reach the ends of the earth had begun in one man standing up in Jerusalem. The early church moved through Jerusalem like water through a city. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They gave to anyone who had need. Every day they met in the temple courts and in their homes. They ate together with glad and sincere hearts. The 11 were at the center of it, teaching, healing, preaching in the temple, being arrested and flogged and released and going back to preach again, because the Spirit that had come on them in the upper room had produced something in them that imprisonment and flogging could not remove. The council ordered them not to speak or teach in the name of Jesus. Peter and John replied, "Judge for yourselves whether it is right in God's sight to obey you rather than God. For we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. We cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. But that is the testimony of men who had been present, who had walked the roads and watched the miracles and eaten the meals and been in the upper room and at the beach and on the mountain, who had seen the hands raised in blessing disappear into the sky. But they could not help speaking. The compulsion was not organizational, not the result of a strategy or a campaign or a plan. It was the overflow of people who had encountered something they could not contain, who had been filled with a presence that pressed outward from the inside. They could not help it. And the movement grew. Bar in Jerusalem, then in Judea and Samaria, then to Antioch, then to the roads of the Roman Empire, then to the ships crossing the Mediterranean, then to the edges of the known world, then beyond the edges, bar the ends of the earth, one city at a time. Peter became the rock. Not all at once, not without the continued failures and corrections that had characterized his following from the beginning. But the man who had denied 3 times and wept and been restored at the beach fire became the leader of the early Jerusalem church, the one who stood up at Pentecost, who healed the lame man at the Beautiful Gate, who raised Tabitha from the dead, who received the vision that sent him to the Gentile household of Cornelius and opened the door of the church to the nations. He went to Rome. The tradition of the early church is consistent and strong that Peter went to Rome and led the church there and was eventually crucified, not as Jesus had been crucified, but upside down, because he said he was not worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. Upside down, the fisherman from Capernaum, who had left the nets at the sound of 2 words, who had walked on water and sunk and been caught, who had confessed the Messiah and been called Satan in the same conversation, who had said, "I will lay down my life for you," and then said, "I don't know the man." Bar, who had said yes 3 times at a charcoal fire on a beach in Galilee, and had meant it, for he laid down his life, upside down on a cross in Rome. The prediction Jesus had spoken to him at the beach fulfilled. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God, be glorified God, on a cross in Rome, upside down, as he had requested. But the rock that had been so unreliable in the gospel accounts had become the foundation, not because the unreliability was removed, because it was redeemed, shaped by the Spirit into the particular kind of solidity that only the broken places can produce when they have been healed. James was the first bar of the 12, the first to die for the name. The first martyr among the apostles, the son of Zebedee, the son of thunder, the one who had left the boat and his father and the hired servants on the lake that morning to follow a teacher from Nazareth. King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. But the text gives it 1 sentence, no last words recorded, no final speech, just the fact. James was killed by the sword by Herod in the persecution of the early church. He was the first of the 11 to reach the end of the road, the first to lay down what he had offered to lay down on the road to Jerusalem when Thomas had said, "Let us also go that we may die with him." The first to drink the cup Jesus had asked him about. "Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" "We can," James and John had said, "and we will give you the best seats." But he drank the cup. The first, without the best seat, without the seats of honor at the right and left, with a sword and a king's order and the particular unglamorous reality of what dying for the name actually looked like. But he was the son of thunder. He became the first martyr of the 12.br, and the church that was meant to be scattered by his death was not scattered. The word tells us that when Herod saw that this pleased the Jewish leaders, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. And he arrested Peter and put him in prison, and the church prayed earnestly for him. And the night before Herod was going to bring him to trial, an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said. But the chains fell off Peter's wrists. James died, and the church prayed, and Peter walked out of the prison past the guards. The movement that could not be stopped continued. John lived the longest, bar of all the 12. John outlasted them all, the son of thunder who had become the apostle of love, who had stood at the foot of the cross and taken Mary into his own home, who had run to the tomb and seen the folded cloth and believed, who had said, "It is the Lord," from the boat on the lake. Bar he wrote a gospel, 3 letters, and the Revelation. The gospel that opened in the beginning was the Word, that recorded the I am statements and the vine and the branches and the love one another, as I have loved you, and the do not let your hearts be troubled. That gave us the woman at the well, and Lazarus in the tomb, and Mary in the garden hearing her name, and Thomas saying, "My Lord and my God." But letters that returned again and again to the same insistence. God is love. Let us love one another. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. Br and the Revelation. Written from exile on the island of Patmos, where he had been sent as an old man by the empire that had not been able to kill him. Surrounded by water, alone, hearing the voice like the sound of rushing waters. "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever." But he saw the new creation, the new Jerusalem coming down like a bride, the tree of life bearing fruit for the healing of the nations, the throne and the river, and the throne of God and of the Lamb. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. John, the son of thunder, became the one who wrote "Love Never Fails" and saw the new creation coming, and lived long enough to carry the whole story from the lake in Galilee to the island of Patmos, longer than any of the others. And he wrote it all down so that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. Andrew carried the name to the ends of the earth, .br, or at least to the edges of the known world as he understood them. The traditions of the early church place Andrew in the regions north and east of Jerusalem, in what is now modern Turkey and Greece, and possibly as far as the region around the Black Sea. Scythia, the people the ancient world considered the ends of the earth, but the quiet connector, the one who brought Peter to Jesus, who pointed out the boy with the 5 loaves, who brought the Greeks to Jesus when they asked to see him. Andrew the bringer carried the message to people who had never heard it, into the regions beyond the established roads, into the places the movement had not yet reached. He died in Achaia in Greece, crucified on an X-shaped cross, the shape that has carried his name ever since, the Cross of St. Andrew, that appears on the flags of Scotland and the United Kingdom. The quiet brother from Bethsaida who had said, "We have found the Messiah," to Simon before the ministry had fully begun, carrying his message to the edges of the world. He asked not to be bound to the cross, but tied, so that he would last longer, would have more time to preach from the cross, to speak to the people gathered around it. Bar Andrew, who brought people to the end. But Philip also went to the nations. The tradition places him in Phrygia in what is now Turkey, preaching healing. The one who had said, "Come and see," to Nathanael, now saying, "Come and see," to the peoples of Asia Minor. He died a martyr. Bar Bartholomew, possibly the same as Nathanael who had been seen under the fig tree, who had said, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" and been undone by being seen. He went to Armenia, to India, according to some traditions, and died for the name, but they went, all of them, to the ends of the earth, as they had been told. Thomas went to India. This is the most historically supported of all the apostolic traditions beyond the ones recorded in the New Testament. The Thomas Christians of India, the ancient community of believers in the state of Kerala on the southwestern coast of India that traces its origin to the Apostle Thomas arriving by sea in 52 AD, a community that has existed continuously for nearly 2,000 years, that preserved its traditions when the rest of the world had largely forgotten them. Thomas, the straight-line thinker, the one who needed to know the route before the journey, who had said, "Unless I see, I will not believe," and been met in the doubt by the one who came back through the locked door specifically for him. He went to India. The furthest of all the 12 from the lake in Galilee, the furthest from the world any of them had known before the calling. The man who had needed the most evidence before the commitment walked the furthest from the place where the evidence had been given. Because once Thomas committed, he committed with everything. That had always been the shape of him. "Let us also go that we may die with him. My Lord and my God." And now India. He died in India, near the city now called Chennai on the east coast. Tradition says he was speared to death on a hill that still bears his name, St. Thomas Mount. A church stands there now, has stood in various forms since the earliest centuries of the faith. But the doubter who became the deepest confessor, "My Lord and my God," carried the confession to the far edge of the world, and the church he planted in India is still there. 2,000 years later, still there. Matthew wrote his gospel. The careful recorder, the man of accounts, who had sat at the booth and kept the records of the empire, and then left everything to follow, and brought his discipline with him, who had been recording since the beginning, since the first morning when the crowds pressed in and the teacher spoke with authority, and the details landed in Matthew with the particular weight of a man who was paying attention. He wrote for the Jewish community, demonstrating with meticulous care how Jesus fulfilled the scriptures, beginning with the genealogy, Abraham to David, David to the exile to Jesus, the whole arc of the promise running to its destination. Look, Matthew was saying in every page, see how it fits, see how Moses wrote about him, see how the prophets pointed here, see how the Sermon on the Mount is the new law given from a new mountain, see how the feeding of the 5,000 echoes the manna, see how the entry into Jerusalem fulfills Zechariah, see how the 30 pieces of silver landed exactly where they were supposed to land. He made the case. The careful, meticulous, overwhelming case. That Jesus of Nazareth was the one the whole story had been building toward. The tradition says Matthew preached in Judea and then went east, to Persia, to Ethiopia. The accounts vary. What is consistent is that he died for the name. The tax collector who had left the booth at 2 words went far from the booth and did not come back. He had given his life to the one who had walked past and looked at him without contempt, and called him, and received his banquet, and turned the discipline of the careful recorder toward the most important account ever kept, the Gospel of Matthew, still being read, in every language, in every nation, the careful record of the tax collector who could not stop recording. Simon the Zealot went to Persia. The man who had arrived with a political framework that divided the world into the righteous and the collaborators, who had sat at the same table as Matthew the tax collector and learned over 3 years that the kingdom was wider than his politics, that the love your enemies was not a compromise but a command, that the one he followed had come not to drive out the Romans but to do something so much larger that the Romans were not even the right frame. He went to Persia, with Jude the son of James, who had asked at the Last Supper, Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world? The one who had been thinking outward, even in the upper room. Both of them went. The tradition is consistent. Simon and Jude to Persia, preaching the name that had changed everything about how Simon understood the world. The name he had walked toward on the road from Caesarea Philippi and through the upper room and the garden and the locked door and the upper room at Pentecost. They died there, together, for the name the Zealot, who had devoted his life to driving out the occupier, dying for the name of the one who had said, love your enemies in Persia, far from the hills of Galilee, far from the political debates and the fire of a young man certain that he knew what God required. For he had found out what God required, on the roads, at the table with Matthew, in the upper room, at the charcoal fire on the beach, in the locked room when the peace be with you came through the locked door. What God required was the towel and the basin, the grain of wheat falling into the ground, the love that goes all the way. Simon had gone all the way, to Persia, for the one who had found him in the zealot's fire and turned it towards something larger, the ones whose names history has held less clearly. James the son of Alphaeus, called James the Less, who sat in the group without the prominence of the other James, who followed without the dramatic story of a brother bringing him or a fig tree or a tax booth or a political movement, just called, just there, just present. Tradition sends him to Egypt, to the founding of the church in Alexandria, a church that would become one of the great centers of Christian thought and theology in the ancient world, that would produce Origen and Athanasius and the great Alexandrian tradition, all of it beginning in the region where James the Less may have gone with the name of Jesus. Thaddeus, who had asked at the Last Supper, Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world? Who had been thinking about the people outside the room, thinking outward. He went outward. Tradition places him in Edessa in what is now Turkey, in the region that was the edge of the Parthian Empire, the border between the Roman world and the world beyond it. He preached there and died there for the name. These are the ones who walked the roads of Galilee and heard the teaching on the mountain and distributed the bread and watched the storm stilled and stood somewhere in Jerusalem on Saturday, and then stood in the locked room when the peace be with you came through the door and received the Spirit at Pentecost and went. Without the famous stories, without the Gospels written about them, without the dramatic martyrdoms that history remembered in detail, just went to the edges and preached and died. For the one who had said, come follow me on a hillside and a lakeshore and a tax booth and under a fig tree, they went, all of them, they all went. What became of the 12? They went to the ends of the earth. or as close to the ends of the earth as any of them could reach in the decades they were given. Into every region of the known world and beyond the known world, carrying the same message, the same name, the same testimony. Bar, we have seen the Lord. Bar, that is what they carried, not a philosophy or a system or a religion in the institutional sense. A testimony, the report of people who had been present, who had walked the roads and eaten the meals and watched the miracles and stood in the locked room and eaten breakfast on the beach and watched the hands raised in blessing disappear into the sky. But we have seen the Lord, and they would not stop saying it, could not be made to stop, not by imprisonment, not by flogging, not by swords and spears and crosses. Every attempt to silence the testimony produced more testimony, the blood of the martyrs becoming the seed of the church in every generation. 11 of the 12 died for the name. Judas had walked into the night and not come back, but the 11 who were left after the garden and the cross and the Saturday and the locked room and Pentecost, 11 men who had been fishermen and a tax collector and a zealot and a questioner and the quiet connector and the sons of thunder, 11 ordinary men from Galilee and Judea. All of them died for it, except John, who lived to be old on an island in exile, writing Love Never Fails and seeing the new creation coming to all of them. For the one who had said, "Come follow me," they had followed all the way to the ends of the earth, to the swords and the crosses and the spears and the exile, all the way. And the testimony they died for is still being spoken in every language, in every nation, in every generation, from that one to this one. We have seen the Lord. Father. We come to the end of the story of the 12, and we come with full hearts, having walked from the fishing villages of Galilee to the ends of the earth, from the morning on the lake when 2 words changed the direction of 12 ordinary lives, to the moment when those lives had gone as far as they could go in every direction the world offered. We thank you for the choosing, that you chose 12 ordinary people, not the best or the brightest or the most spiritually advanced or the most likely candidates by any measure the world uses. Fishermen and a tax collector and a zealot and a questioner, and the ones whose names history barely held. You chose them, called them, formed them, sent them. And you are still choosing that way. Still calling the ordinary, still finding the restless fisherman and the guilty tax collector and the politically committed and the quietly watching and the loudly impulsive, still saying, "Come, follow me," to people who have no idea what they are saying yes to. We thank you for the forming, for the 3 years of proximity to the one who was the fullest expression of what a human life looked like when it was fully aligned with you. For the miracles and the teaching and the sending out and the failures and the corrections and the patient repeated instruction, for the upper room and the basin and the towel, for the bread and the cup, for the garden where the yes was said again in the dark, for the cross that ended the argument for pride and the empty tomb that ended the argument for despair. We thank you for what the cross looked like from the inside of the 12, for Peter weeping outside the courtyard, for John standing at the foot, for the women who stayed when others ran, for the Saturday that was not the last word, because Saturday never is, for the stone rolled away and the folded cloth and the name spoken in the garden, and the peace be with you through the locked door. We thank you that the forming did not end with the ascension, that the Spirit who fell on the upper room at Pentecost is still falling, still forming, still taking the ordinary and making it capable of carrying what ordinary could not carry alone. We thank you for what became of them. For Peter, who denied and was restored and laid down his life upside down on a cross in Rome because he was not worthy to die the same way as his Lord. For John, who stood at the cross and received a mother and lived to be old and wrote Love Never Fails and saw the new creation. For James, who was the first and drank the cup and died by the sword, and the church prayed and kept going. For Andrew, who brought his brother and brought the Greeks and went to the edges and preached from his cross. For Philip, who said, "Come and see," and kept saying it all the way to his death. For Thomas, who said, "My Lord and my God," and meant it all the way to India. For Matthew, who left the booth and kept recording and made the case so the generations that followed could read it. For Simon the Zealot, who learned that the kingdom was wider than his politics and went to Persia to prove it. For the ones whose names history held lightly and whose faithfulness God held completely. We thank you that the story did not stop with them, that the testimony they carried and died for kept moving, from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth, from the first century to this one, from the upper room to wherever you are hearing these words right now. The testimony is still moving, the name is still being carried. The movement that began on a hillside in Galilee with 12 ordinary people saying yes to 2 words has not stopped moving in 2,000 years. You are part of it. If you belong to Him, you are a chapter in the same story, called by the same voice, formed by the same Spirit, sent by the same commission. Go, and I am with you always, to the very end of the age. And so we ask today for what the 12 needed and received. For the grace to answer the calling. Whatever form the come follow me has taken in your life, whatever the nets are that you have been asked to leave, whatever the booth or the fig tree or the political certainty or the quiet corner where you have been sitting waiting for someone to come. He has come, he is still coming. The same voice that found Peter on the shore and Matthew at the booth and Nathanael under the fig tree and Simon in the zealot's fire is still finding, still calling, still saying come. Answer it, not because you are ready. None of the 12 were ready when they were called. Not because you understand what you are saying yes to, none of them did. Not because you have the faith required. Peter walked on water with faith the size of a moment and sunk and was caught. Answer it, because the one calling you is worth following, because the road he is asking you to walk leads somewhere the life you are living without him cannot reach. Because the thing that is stirring in you when you hear his name is not your own longing. It is his call. For the grace to stay close, to remain in the vine, to do the thing the disciples failed to do in Gethsemane, to keep watch, to pray, to not let the distance grow between you and the one who is the source of everything the life requires, for the grace to go, in whatever direction the Spirit is sending, to the next person, to the next conversation, to the next place where the name has not yet been spoken or has been spoken and not yet received, to the ends of whatever earth you have been placed in. And he is with you, always, to the very end of the age. The same promise given on a mountain in Galilee to 11 ordinary people, given to you right now, in whatever your ordinary is. He is with you, the one who chose you, who is forming you, who will send you, and who will be with you every step of the way to wherever the going leads. Always, to the very end of the age. World without end. Amen.